If you weren't there, what would be the point of me staying in that palace of yours? Han Sen asked distractedly as he turned the needle over in his hands. That is my business, just do as you're told, Isha said. Han Sen smiled at Isha. I must apologize, my queen. I am a guy who would rather have his freedom and be able to relax as he chooses. I'm not a fan of staying put and looking after something. You should really go and take care of your own palace. Isha returned his smile with a wry one of her own. If I could return, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, would I? She started to say something more, but suddenly Han Sen froze. He was staring at the ghost statue, and with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the needle toward it. Isha sighed. She had spent some time researching that bone needle. It was almost completely indestructible, but it had no power. She had been unable to feel any power residing at its tip. If she had been able to use the bone needle, and any power it possessed to break the ghost statue, she wouldn't have been bound there when Han Sen found her. But Isha stared with a slack jaw as the bone needle sailed toward the statue, completely unimpeded. The ghost statue had knocked Han Sen to the ground countless times, but it didn't react to the bone needle at all. It merely watched the bone needle strike its forehead. How is this possible? Isha's eyes were wide. She gazed at the strange scene with disbelief. When the bone needle pierced the ghost statue's forehead, the needle lit up red. It shone brighter and brighter, and before long, the ghost statue started to shake. The noise of breaking rocks began to rumble around them. Pang! The next moment the statue fell to pieces, the grip holding Isha, and the blood Kirin was suddenly released. They fell to the bridge, the shattered remains of the statue's hands falling around them. The blood Kirin was injured, but it hadn't lost much strength. It gathered itself back up, and its signature red cloud swirled around it. Isha was close to death, and the blood in her body had almost run dry. She was very weak, and she didn't have the strength to react. She fell to the ground limply. Han Sen caught her in his arms to prevent her from hitting the bridge. He smiled and said, "My queen, it looks like you are going to have to tend to your palace after all." The purple air across the entire jade bridge began to spread and thin. Giant rocks began to fall. Isha was held in Han Sen's arms. As she looked up at Han Sen from below, her heart started to feel strange. She had never seen a man from a lower angle. She was always the one up high. She had never felt like this before. And suddenly, she started to feel even weaker. As the last pieces of the ghost statue fell, the purple air across the bridge began to evaporate. Han Sen, the blood Kirin, and Isha started to return to normal. The jade bridge that had seemed endless now looked as it previously had. They could see the other 12 jade bridges around them, and the 13 teleporters in front of them. Fox Queen and the others, however, were gone. They must have traveled through the teleporter and left that palace. Because the blood Kirin was injured, Han Sen opted not to ride it. He was still holding Isha as he strode across the jade bridge. "You're not going to go through the teleporter?" Isha asked weakly from where she was cradled against Han Sen's chest. "Of course I will. But before that, I want to walk across the rest of the jade bridges," Han Sen said with a smile. Han Sen wanted to walk the 13 bridges for one simple reason. He wanted to get each statue's power. After Isha gave him the bone needle, he realized that the bone needle was a xenogenic treasure that combined with Blood Pulse Plunder. If he used Blood Pulse Plunder by itself, he would need to beat the enemy first. He couldn't use Blood Pulse Plunder to take away an opponent's blood pulse until the enemy didn't have enough power to fight back. If Han Sen was squaring off against an extra strong enemy, though, there was always the chance that he might not be able to beat them. During times like that, Blood Pulse Plunder wouldn't be very useful. But with this bone needle, things were different. Han Sen could imbue the bone needle with the powers of Blood Pulse Plunder. After that, he only had to put the bone needle into an enemy's body, and the bone needle would plunder the enemy's blood pulse. Han Sen only needed to stick the needle into a foe. That being said, the bone needle wasn't powerful on its own. Han Sen would have to use his own strength. But piercing a needle into an enemy was still far easier than trying to beat an opponent that had him bested. The statues on the 13 bridges were each prepared for the combination of Blood Pulse Plunder and the bone needle. The bone needle could easily pierce the statues and take the hidden blood pulse power that resided within them. Han Sun would basically have to repeat what he did to the ghost statue. The bone needle had a concentration of power now too. It was just a drop, but it was a blood pulse hell power. It was a deified power. There had to be something similar on the other 12 bridges. That was something Han Sun was most assuredly not going to miss out on. Han Sun switched positions and carried Isha on his back. He walked to another jade bridge, and just as he had expected, the first half was safe. When he approached a statue in the middle of the bridge, he used the bone needle to absorb the blood pulse power inside the statue. The statue then fell, and the bridge lost its protection. It became an ordinary jade bridge again. Han Sun walked through the rest of the bridges, and took the blood pulse power from the statues. Isha's surprise was written plainly across her face, making it obvious that she had no clue why the bone needle was so powerful in Han Sen's hands. Isha had picked up the bone needle, but she had no idea that the needle had to be used in conjunction with blood pulse plunder. She didn't have blood pulse plunder, so aside from its sturdiness, the needle had no utility in her hands. The second sacred leader statue had been destroyed for some reason, so Han Sun hadn't been able to retrieve the bone needle personally. Yet it landed in his hands anyway when Isha volunteered it. The sacred leader had blocked all the routes, but something had been left on each path for those that traversed it. The items were connected with each other in ways that Han Sun hadn't yet figured out. The sacred leader's full plans were still a mystery. The silver Saises, blood pulse plunder, the bone needle, 13 blood pulse powers. They were all very rare and valuable treasures. At this point, he could easily start a fight with a deified being. The treasures were meant to be obtained through tests given by the sacred leader. No one had realized how scary the sacred leader's treasures could be. "My queen, are you afraid of needles?" Han Sun asked Isha. Isha was shocked, and she did not know what he meant. "I mean, are you afraid of being pricked with a needle?" Han Sun blinked and asked, "Are you going to give me a shot?" Isha looked at Han. Senator Han Sun lifted his bone needle, while he smiled at Isha. "Close your eyes if you are afraid. The pain will be over in a second." After that, Han Sun thrust his bone needle into Isha's chest. A drop of hell blood came out, and it blended into Isha's own blood. If he wanted to survive, he had to get rid of Fox Queen. And unless another deified elite challenged her, it was unlikely Fox Queen could be defeated. Even with Han Sen's deified blood pulse, his actual power wouldn't be deified. Isha, however, was different. She was half a step away from being deified herself. Getting the hell blood pulse would give her a boost towards the lofty goal of becoming deified. This was their best chance of taking the sacred leader's treasure. The hell blood pulse blended into Isha's body. Suddenly, a plume of purple air burst out of Isha. It solidified into a purple substance chain, and wrapped around her, loop upon loop. Everything she had, her clothes, her accessories, her armor, and all sorts of other things, disintegrated into nothing but dust under the power of that substance chain. As the chain surrounded her, Isha curled her long body into a ball, like a fetus in the womb. Once Isha was safely encased within the purple cocoon, all became quiet. In a giant palace, Fox Queen, Mr. White, and Crime were traveling forward. Fox Queen suddenly stopped. She looked around her and said, "Mr. White, is this the correct path? Why have we been walking for so long, and yet we are still in the same palace?" Mr. White slowly said, "This must be the 4th checkpoint for the treasure. We have to travel through here to get to where the treasure is." "How do we get through here then?" Fox Queen asked Mr. White. "This palace seems to have a space power restriction. My powers are weak here, and so I am afraid I might not be able to break the restriction. Perhaps this is something you will have to do," Mr. White said after a think. "And how would I do something like that?" Fox Queen asked with a frown. "Judging from the calculations I have made, we can start right there." Mr. White pointed at a stone pillar as he spoke. Fox Queen looked at the stone pillar and groaned. She didn't move. Han Sun stared at Isha with a look of surprise. The whole process had gone far better than he expected. The Hell Blood Pulse activated the Hell King blood she had inside her body. They fused with Isha's already considerable strength. She had broken through and become deified with no trouble at all. When she emerged from her cocoon and ascended, Isha was wearing a set of purple armor. Her regal presence blanketed everything around them, as if she was the queen of the entire universe. If you dare to tell anyone about what just happened, I will kill you. Isha stared daggers at Han Sun as she spoke. My queen, I didn't see anything. Han Sun blinked innocently, but deep inside he was thinking to himself, women are weird. Moments ago, she was begging to be deified. And now, after becoming deified, she still isn't happy. Does she really care about a small and inconsequential detail like being naked? Her naked body is quite nice. Why is she so upset? Isha only stared at Han Sun in response. She turned silently and looked to the 13 teleporters. Then she said, which teleporter do you think we should use? Clearly, Isha wasn't very good when it came to this sort of maze. It seemed as if she had forced her way through the palaces by trial and error. I'm not very good at figuring out the path either. If I was to guess, though, I would assume they went through the teleporter at the end of the life and death cycle bridge. But even if we select the right one this time, we won't know where to go next. We'd have to try every single one we come to. Han Sun stopped to think for a moment, and then resumed talking. My queen, how did you come this far in the first place? Isha thought and said, I was with the Ice Blue Knights. While I was exploring a planet with a group of knights, we accidentally woke up a deified xenogeniac called Under Overbearing. I was swallowed by it. At first I thought I was dead. I had been swallowed, and I knew that its stomach could digest anything. Even deified creatures would melt in there. Just when I lost all hope, I found a seam that allowed me to escape the stomach. I wiggled through the crack and got out. After traversing many caves and passing by a shattered statue, I ended up entering a palace. It must have been one of the palaces on Under Overbearing's back. Wait a minute. Are you saying that you aren't the one who destroyed the floor in one of the palaces? And you didn't break the sacred leader statue? Han Sun asked Isha with shock. Of course not. My power wasn't strong enough to destroy anything in the palace, Isha said. If you didn't break the palace, then that means someone else entered the palaces before you did. That crack in Under Overbearing's stomach might have also been his work, Han Sun mused quietly. Isha nodded. It is certainly possible, and he might indeed be around here someplace. What makes you think that? Han Sun asked curiously. The crack in the Under Overbearing's stomach couldn't have been there for very long. With how quickly the beast heals, the wound must have been made less than a week before. After a week, the damaged stomach would have healed completely, Isha said slowly. Han Sun frowned. Then he might really still be in these palaces. But how could he leave no trace in the palace? If he was here, he would have left behind some indication of his presence. But aside from that one ruined palace, the rest of the trail was left by you, yes? Isha nodded and said, yes. And while I was exploring, I didn't see any sign of someone else having entered. Plus, he broke the statue, but he didn't take the bone needle inside. That's just weird. Was he too careless to find out what it harbored? But then again, how could such a powerful elite be that careless? It doesn't really make any sense, Han Sun said. Isha sighed. Maybe he just doesn't care about the items in this place? Han Sun was stunned by the suggestion, but as he considered the idea, it made sense. That might indeed be possible. He must be a very powerful person to create a hole in Under Overbearing's stomach. Maybe his real target is the final treasure of the sacred leader. If that is the case, then that doesn't bode well for us. Han Sun walked across the bridge of life and death. They arrived at the door of light and walked on through. The teleporter deposited them into a palace, the same as usual. There was a main hall, 2 side halls and a hall in the back. All in all, there were 4 different teleporters. Han Sun looked around and spoke to Isha. I think they left via the back hall. How do you know that? Isha asked in surprise. I can see the auras left behind by their bodies, Han Sun explained simply. He was suspicious too though. The more powerful a person was, the less of a trail they would leave behind. And that trail didn't last forever. Mr. White and the others had been gone for a long time by this point. Under ordinary circumstances, it should have been hard for Han Sun to detect the trace elements they had left behind. In fact, Han Sun didn't see any traces of Fox Queen or crime, but he could see molecules that Mr. White had left lingering in the air. That didn't seem normal. Perhaps Mr. White made his trail visible on purpose? Han-sun guessed to himself. But how could he know that Isha and I would survive? Why is he leaving me clues? Or is this all just a trap? Han-sun and Isha were unable to make the calculations to determine the correct path. But instead of marching ahead recklessly, they could follow the traces left behind by Mr. White. In the end, that proved to be a very effective solution for navigating the palaces. Han-sun, Isha, and the Blood Kirin followed Mr. White's tracks through each teleporter door. Han-sun was the guide. Thankfully, they didn't encounter any dangers along the way. They went through a few palaces, and their journey remained uneventful. It was an entirely safe course to follow. What is Mr. White planning? Han-sun wondered. He didn't know why Mr. White was taking this risk. It didn't make sense for Mr. White to believe that Han-sun had the strength to stand up to Fox Queen. It also didn't seem likely that Mr. White would leave a trail behind just to cause Fox Queen trouble. Using the evidence of Mr. White's passage as a guide, Han-sun and Isha made quick progress. It wasn't long before they arrived at the fourth checkpoint. What they saw there made Han-sun and Isha frown profusely. The hall was half collapsed. Broken pillars and remnants of a destroyed ceiling lay strewn across the entire place. Han-sun looked across the hall, but he found no hide nor hair of a sacred leader statue there. In fact, there was nothing of any remarkability there. It looks like Fox Queen managed to make it through this checkpoint, Han-sun said when he found nothing of interest in the palace. I wonder what the sacred leader left behind here. Whatever it was, Fox Queen must have made off with it. Han-sun frowned. The sacred leader's items were all linked. If they were missing an item, they might run into a lot of trouble further down the line. Han-sun and Isha had no choice but to keep going. When they went through the next teleporter, though, what they saw gave them a shock. They hadn't arrived at another palace. When they stepped out of the teleporter, they found themselves on the shore of an endless ocean. Under overbearing was as big as a planet. It wasn't really surprising to see an ocean on such an entity, but the sight still made Han-sun feel depressed. Mr. White and the others must have begun crossing the oceans, but the ocean wind had destroyed all traces of Mr. White's trail. It's such a big ocean. I'm afraid it might be too difficult to locate Mr. White and the others, Han-sun said sadly. Isha looked around. After a while of thought, she said, this could be where the sacred leader hid his treasure. Perhaps they haven't even gone very far, but they're exploring someplace below the waves. Han-sun had thought of this possibility as well. If the treasure was in the water, finding Mr. White and the others might be even harder. I guess we have no choice but to take a look, Han-sun said. Isha nodded and dipped into the sea. Her body unleashed a purple smoke, and when the smoke came into contact with the water parted. Han-sun and the Blood Kirin moved next to Isha. They headed deep into the sea, surrounded by the sphere of dryness provided by Isha. Isha's purple smoke kept the water about 10 meters at bay. After they started their dive, they descended deep into the ocean. They walked 100 miles beneath the sea, and in all that time, they didn't catch sight nor sound of any other creature. The ocean looked dead. It was like a long dead sea that was no longer fit for any living thing. Suddenly, a giant shadow moved in the water. Isha stopped and stared at that giant shadow in the sea. The shadow was approaching them quickly. Han-sun was given a proper fright when he saw what the thing was. It was a giant xenogeniac that looked like a whale. Its body was pure white. The white whale was more than 1,000 meters long, and every move sent devastating shockwaves rolling through the sea. Many small vortexes popped up around it. Deified creature, Isha said quietly. I didn't expect under Overbearing's body to be the home of other deified creatures. I'm afraid that, aside from the sacred leader, no other being could do something like that. Han-sun had a wry smile. The big white whale noticed the three of them. After all, there were no other creatures in that ocean, so their presence was rather noticeable. That was especially true of Isha and the Blood Kirin. One of them was a deified elite, and the other was full of blood air. It was difficult not to notice their presence. When the big white whale was 1,000 meters away from them, it suddenly opened its mouth and released a high-pitched sonic wave. At the same time, its mouth produced a strong force of suction. Many giant vortexes swirled to life within the water. They snared everything within range, and pulled it all into the whale's belly. Wisps of Isha's purple air began to flow into that vortex, and their sphere of air suddenly started to feel the force of that suction. More and more of the purple air was pulled away through the water, taken in the direction of the creature's mouth. Isha frowned. She used her hand as a knife, and the purple air suddenly gathered up into a large swathe of knife air. She lifted her arms above her head and slashed towards the vortex. The knife air became a roaring purple air demon. It was headed right for the giant white whale. It broke through the vortex that the big white whale had generated, but the demon-looking knife air didn't stop there. It continued on, going right for the white whale's head. The big white whale showed no indication that it was going to dodge the incoming blow. In fact, its mouth widened even further. It looked like a gaping black hole. Its powers of suction increased, and it swallowed Isha's demon knife air effortlessly. Gudong! The giant white whale swallowed the demonic knife air whole, then let out a satisfied burp. It then spat out some air, and created loads of bubbles in the sea. Han-sun was dumbfounded. Isha had just become deified, and she was filled with hell power. She also had the teeth knife skills. Her talents were famous among many races, and her wrecking abilities were widely renowned. The big white whale, however, had swallowed her attack easily. The power that the giant white whale possessed was truly scary. Isha frowned. Purple substance chains rose from her body and began to align in mysterious patterns. They created a purple knife air around Isha's body. Isha's entire body was now full of a knife mind. It felt to Han-sun, as if she was a cruel knife herself, that she could wreck anything at any time. Isha raised the full extent of her power and prowess, but the giant white whale still didn't seem to be afraid. It opened its mouth, and the black hole power returned. It sucked everything nearby into its mouth. Sand and water came rolling in like they were being pulled into a bottomless pit. Seeing the giant white whale open its mouth again, Isha coldly shouted. Her arms swung at the big white whale. The roaring demon headed for the big white whale once more, dispersing the sand and shattering the rocks as it went. It left a trail of devastation behind it. The purple knife air and the big white whale's black hole collided with each other. The black hole was destroyed, and the purple knife air was shattered. The shockwave of the collision exploded the entire sea. Huge waves surged across its surface, and it was like the entire ocean had been turned upside down. The two strikes were balanced, though neither had the upper hand. The next second, Isha and Han-sun's eyes widened. The big white whale's mouth was still hanging open, and suddenly, something flew out of it. It wrapped around Isha, Han-sun, and the blood Kirin, then pulled them into the big white whale's belly. It was a big bronze bell that had covered Han-sun, Isha, and the blood Kirin. Isha's purple substance chain became a knife air. She waved her hand to strike the surface of the bell, but it only made a loud, tolling noise. The bell showed no sign of damage. What is this bell? Why was it in the white whale's belly? Can xenogenics make use of xenogenic treasures? Han-sun was shocked. Dong! The bronze bell landed on something, and then it stopped moving. Isha continued to strike the bell with her knife air, but the bronze bell suddenly lifted away from them. It flew to the side, freeing them. Isha immediately surrounded Han-sun and the blood Kirin with her power to protect them. Based on the direction that the bell had moved after it covered them, they should have been standing inside the white whale, probably in its stomach. A deified xenogenics digestion system wasn't something an ordinary creature could hope to withstand. Even king-class elites would dissolve quickly inside such a stomach. But when Han-sun and Isha looked around, they froze. This was not a stomach. It was a control room of high-end technology. The tech around them equaled any that might be found in a classy battleship's control room. The most unbelievable thing was that everything in the control room was transparent. They could see outside of the room, and the feelings that the sight elicited were difficult to explain. Although it looked like a whale from the exterior, it was actually governed by machinery. Every piece of the whale's interior was made of crystal of various colors. Humming generators, pounding pistons, and spinning every movement could be seen from where they were. What is this thing? This time, Han-sun was really shocked. The white whale had looked like a deified creature from the outside, but it was actually a technological marvel. It was hard to believe that such an amazing machine actually existed. Isha looked around in shock. Their eyes soon turned to a platform of that primary control room. A man had been sitting in a chair behind the control platform. It was little more than a skeleton at this point, with a few white bones still wrapped in the clothes he had been wearing. The man's clothes looked like a high-tech product, not some treasure armor. Judging from the style of the silver and black clothing, it was possible to determine that the skeleton had been a man. After bringing Han's son and the others into the room, the bronze bell had drastically reduced its size. It was now about the size of a man's fist, and it rested there in the main control room. Does this sort of technology exist anywhere else in the Geno universe? Han's son looked at Isha. He had no idea what race might have constructed this marvel of technology. Isha shook her head. There are many technological wonders that have the destructive powers of a deified being, but not many can actually be used in combat. They take far too long to aim and fire, so they can't be used in actual deified fights. They are mostly useful for attacking planets, since planets cannot be moved. The Mechas bioarmor is also technological in nature. They have very powerful weapons, but again, they are different from what we're seeing here. Clearly, Isha was just as clueless as Han Sr. This has to be another one of the Sacred Leader's creations. Sacred achieved a lot when it came to technology. Han's son pondered aloud as he looked around. Since the white whale's master appeared to be quite dead, how could the white whale continue to move without someone at the controls? And what had prompted the behemoth to swallow them? Isha walked toward the skeleton. She waved her hand, and one of her purple substance chains dissolved into a purple mist. The mist flowed over the skeleton and began to poke around it. She was looking for some lead or clue they could follow. But before Isha's purple air touched the skeleton, the bronze bell rose from its resting platform and covered up Isha's purple air at once. This old bronze bell defends its master automatically. Is it a piece of technology as well? Han's son looked at the old bronze bell in shock. Suddenly, Han's son and Isha heard a boy's voice. You are a technological product. Your entire family is a technological product. Who is that? Han's son and Isha were shocked. They looked around them, but neither of them could sense any presences. There was just that soul skeleton sitting on the primary control deck. It made Han's son and Isha feel very uncomfortable. No way. Have we encountered a ghost? Han's son muttered as he stared at the skeleton. He used his Dongxian aura to scan the skeleton multiple times, but there was no life force. It couldn't have been any more dead, so there was no way that the voice was coming from it. Han's son could only think that they must be talking to a ghost. You are a ghost. Your entire family is a ghost. The little boy's voice was heard again, and it sounded pretty mad. This time, Han's son and Isha located the source of the voice. It came from the little bronze bell. The bronze bell shook. Strange symbols glowed across it, and it opened shiny green eyes. Below its eyes was a gap. It looked like a mouth that kept opening and closing. Han's son stared at the bronze bell that was shouting at him. The body of the bell seemed to be vibrating with rage. What is this thing? Han's son didn't know how to react. He hadn't displayed any signs of a life force, so he thought it must be a xenogenic treasure. But now that it was talking, it certainly seemed to possess all the traits and characteristics of a living creature. You are a thing. Your entire family is a thing. The bronze bell was becoming even angrier. It was jumping up and down as it shouted. Are you an AI? If you are, it seems like you are a very cheap one. You can only say the same thing over and over, Han's son said, looking at the bronze bell with curiosity. The bronze bell started to yell. You are a... It trailed off halfway through its shout. If it continued, people really would believe it was an AI. So after its half shout, the bronze bell stopped and settled down a little. With a very cocky look it said, You stupid low-life creature. Listen up. Your master's name is Big King Bell. But you guys can call me either Master or Big King. After that, Big King Bell thought of something. It looked at Han's son and said, Your master is not some sort of AI. Han's son looked at Isha. They were confused. What was this thing? It was sort of like a treasure, but it wasn't a treasure. It was sort of like a creature, but it wasn't a creature. The jade drum was a creature, But the jade drum was created naturally. It wasn't something that was man-made. Words were scrawled across the little bell's body, though, and that suggested it wasn't a natural being. Okay, Big King. Why did you snatch us and bring us here? Han-sun asked the bell. Big King Bell rolled its eyes and jumped. He said, What do you mean by snatch? I was saving you guys. Couldn't you tell? Don't talk big if you don't know shit, kid. You were saving us. How? Han-sun looked at Big King Bell with confusion. Ugh, you guys don't understand anything. And yet here you come, waltzing into the Holy Spirit Sea. You must have a death wish. If it wasn't for me saving you guys, you too would have ended up like him. You know, with only bones left. The bell jumped up to land atop the skeleton's skull as it spoke. Who is he? Han-sun asked with curiosity. He had originally thought that the skeleton was Big King Bell's master. But now, that didn't seem to be the case. Huh? This piece of garbage? How do you expect me to remember who he was? He was just another pawn, like a background extra in this tale. Big King Bell proclaimed, lifting his lips in disdain. Han-sun didn't believe the bell. There was no way that an unimportant person would have been in charge of controlling a technological marvel like the white whale. Even if the man hadn't been very powerful personally, he could have used the whale to hold his own against a deified being. How did he die? Isha asked Big King Bell. Big King Bell rolled its eyes. He thought that since he had this strange machine, he could cross the Holy Spirit Sea and take the sacred leader's treasure. He had no idea of the power of the Holy Spirit Sea. This thing didn't stand a chance of repelling the sea's power. Not in the least. He died before he even made it to Holy Spirit Town. Only his bones remained. After that, Big King Bell jumped onto the control platform and cockily said, But this thing was quite interesting, and so I decided to hold on to it as a keepsake. Han-sun knew Big King Bell was talking about the white whale. He looked at the skeleton and told Isha, This guy must have dived a long time ago. He didn't get here recently. What? Another creature was here? Big King Bell asked before Isha could respond. He seemed startled as he stared at Han Sr. Yeah, there's a few of them. Han-sun looked at Big King Bell and asked, You came here too. What is so strange about that? Ha, I was here. Big King Bell trailed off as a thought crossed his mind. He stopped talking. Hear what? Han-sun asked. Ha. Big King Bell grunted and said, That is none of your business. Don't you have the relic with you? How were so many other creatures able to reach this place? Or is Under Overbearing now so old that people are reaching the palace through his mouth? Han-sun was shocked that Big King Bell knew he possessed the relic. This bell seemed to know things that it shouldn't. So perhaps it was connected to the sacred leader's treasure somehow. Let's not waste our breath. Give me the relic, and when I open the holy town's treasury, you will receive what you are owed. Big King Bell hovered in the air before Han-sun as it spoke. You can have the relic, but I will have to see if you have what it takes. Han-sun smiled. I was born deified. I have beaten billions of people in this universe. I am the strongest in the sky or on the land. Even the sacred leader, when he met with me, would refer to me as Big King Brother. Are you honestly trying to compete with me? Big King Bell looked at Han-sun with actual surprise. He hadn't expected Han-sun to be so ignorant. Big King Brother, even if you are so strong, you should demonstrate that strength. Otherwise, how am I honestly supposed to believe that you are as strong as you claim? Han-sun put out his hands as he spoke. I pulled you guys in here on a whim. Wasn't that enough? Do I have to kill you idiots to show you how strong I am? Big King Bell looked at Han-sun coldly as he slowly rose higher into the air. He looked as if he was going to kill Han Sr. Big King Brother. It was a powerful demonstration when you grabbed us. But that isn't enough to make us want to hand over the relic. Will you show me again? If you can convince us, I will give you the relic without argument. Han-sun smiled at Big King Bell. He thought that the Big King Bell was quite interesting, and that was an impetus for Han-sun to trash-talk it. The bronze bell had shielded them as it pulled them inside, but that was because they hadn't been prepared for its sudden arrival. Isha still hadn't shown off her true strength, so Han-sun wasn't worried about annoying the bell. Big King Brother looked down on Han-sun with utter disdain. Even a small fraction of my power would convince you to obey me, but I have way too many powerful Geno arts. Let me think of a weaker one I can show you, just in case my Geno art is too strong, and I accidentally end up killing you all. Big King Bell spun in the air twice, looking as if he had made a decision. He jumped onto the control platform and punched a few buttons. The white whale then rose to the surface and opened its mouth. The front of the control room looked out through the white whale's eyes, letting the operator see what was going on outside. Idiots! I am going to open your eyes to my power. I am going to show you the techniques of a real and invincible elite, Big King Bell said. His body began to glow green and spin as it grew bigger and bigger. The bell turned onto its side, aiming its opening out the white whale's mouth. Then, they heard a loud chiming noise from the bell. A scary shockwave blasted out of the bell. Boom! The whole sea was cut in half by the bell's sonic blast. The waters were parted down to the seafloor, and all the way to the opposite shore of the ocean. Oh damn! This guy really does have a lot of power. Han Sun was frozen. Big King Bell's power really did seem to exceed that of Isha and Fox Queen. Isha looked shaken too. The power that Big King Bell released was truly magnificent. Holy Spirit Sea wasn't just a vat of ordinary seawater either. Isha didn't think she could split that much of it. So how about that? Do you guys believe me now? Give me the relic at once. Follow me, before I decide that I don't like you. If you do come, you guys will benefit greatly, Big King Bell said to Han Sun with a lot of pride. While they were talking, 3 shadows appeared above the sea. It was Fox Queen Mr. White and Crime. When Fox Queen saw the big white whale, she shook her fox tail. An invisible cord of power lashed around the white whale, and she lifted it out of the sea. Big King Bell quickly leaped atop the platform and hit the buttons on the panels. The white whale opened its mouth and created a black hole, then sent a force of suction towards Fox Queen. But Fox Queen's hand tugged on the cord of power, binding the white whale's mouth. The white whale was unable to open its maw, and so the black hole died inside it. Han Sun was waiting to see how Big King Bell disposed of Fox Queen. If she was killed, they'd lose a dangerous enemy. But when Han Sun turned around, he saw Big King Bell pulling out a big bag seemingly out of nowhere. The bell was going to flee out of the whale via the back door. Big King Brother, aren't you going to kill her? Han Sun asked with confusion. I am busy. I will let her live for now, but I will surely remember her. The next time I see her, I will blow some air at her to kill her, Big King Bell said firmly. Then he left through the back door with his big bag in tow. Han Sun and Isha were frozen. They weren't sure about how to react. That guy seemed very spirited. What would make him run away in such a hurry? Han Sun looked at Isha with confusion. Isha sighed and said, maybe its power takes a long time to regenerate. That strike he unleashed might have cost him most of the power he had gathered. Now Han Sun was able to understand. It was like the Red Mist King, that depended on the 7 red mist minks for energy. It took a very long time for such power to be gathered. If Big King Bell had failed to bluff Han Sun and Isha, it knew it had to run once Fox Queen showed up. What do we do now then? Han Sun asked, looking at Isha. Isha didn't answer. She teleported to the back door. Han Sun knew what she meant by that. He mounted the blood Kirin and followed after Isha. Big King Bell was a big phony, but he was familiar with the surrounding area. Getting information from him could be quite useful. After they rushed out of the white whale, Isha's body flashed away. The blood Kirin was unable to catch up with her. It was like a human having a foot race against a sports car. Half deified, had the word deified in it, but they were still king-class beings at their core. Real deified beings were in another league entirely. Han Sun. Isha had chased after Big King Bell, quickly disappearing. Upon seeing Han Sun emerge from the white whale's belly, Fox Queen called out in surprise. Before Han Sun could think of escaping, Fox Queen flashed before him, and the blood Kirin to block their path. Good timing. Give me the relic, and I will spare your lives. Fox Queen narrowed her eyes at Han Sun, but it looked as if she was smiling. Pretty sister, you are giving me more trouble. I don't have the relic on me. Han Sun looked troubled, and he said, did you see that person that just ran off? That was my master Knife Queen. I gave her the relic. In that case, let us see if your master or the relic is the most important thing in your heart, Fox Queen said coolly. Many cords of power slid out of her, and they came slithering over to wrap around Han Sun and the Blood Kirin. But Han Sun patted his bird's nest, which grew bigger to shield him and the Blood Kirin. It blocked out Fox Queen's cords of power. Even so, the cords of power locked tightly around the bird's best. And that meant Han Sun was now unable to escape. My good little brother, you think having this bird's nest will keep me from doing anything to you? Fox Queen smiled. And then she pulled something out from her waist. Han Sun saw the item, and when he did his heart fell. Fox Queen had brought out a small jade flute. It was less than 1 foot long, and it was a translucent creamy color. It looked very small and fragile. Fox Queen, are you proficient in sonic powers? The bird's nest might not be able to filter out noise, so I don't know if it can withstand sonic powers, Han Sun thought to himself. The bird's nest was not a Bysema, and Han Sun couldn't trigger its full power. He used the bird's nest's power as a protective force, but it was difficult to tell if he could block a sonic attack. Fox Queen brought the small jade flute to her lips. She smiled at Han Sun, and then, she opened those red lips. The jade flute began to produce sweet music. The flute wasn't particularly loud, but a very vague chord of power came out of the flute. The chord was coming for the bird's nest. Han Sun was shocked. He realized that the music of the flute could seep through the dry grass of the bird's nest, and that realization made him depressed. He had received the approval of the undying bird's nest, and so he was able to make use of the bird's nest. But that usage was limited. Since he couldn't activate the bird's nest's power, he couldn't utilize its defensive properties. Fox Queen's flute sounds were able to sink into Han Sun's bird's nest, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. That music of the flute sank into the bird's nest like silk strands coming to tangle up Han Sun and the Blood Kirin. Han Sun and the Blood Kirin did their best to free themselves, but they were ultimately unable to get rid of the flute's music. Under the influence of the flute, Han Sun couldn't control himself. He lifted the bird's nest and began crawling out like a puppet on strings. Oh no! Oh no! Han Sun felt terrible. Seeing Han Sun slowly moving out of the bird's nest, Fox Queen's expression was beatific. But when Han Sun saw the smile, he did not feel good. Just as Han Sun was pulled fully from the bird's nest, Fox Queen's expression became surprised. She waved her jade flute. Dong! A purple knife air roared through the air. It was like a demon coming forward to strike Fox Queen's jade flute. That endless purple knife air slashed the jade flute repeatedly, then struck Fox Queen's body and sent her flying 10 kilometers away. Fox Queen broke the knife air and stood still. Isha's body flashed next to Han Sun, and her phoenix eyes moved to meet Fox Queen's beautiful eyes. Fox Queen felt as if she could feel the spark between them. You are Han Sun's teacher? Fox Queen smiled like a flower, but her eyes looked cold. Not bad, Isha answered coldly. Perfect. Han Sun said you possess the relic. Give it to me now, and I will let you both walk free, Fox Queen said coldly. Isha responded seriously. I do not recall having a queen like you to obey. Upon hearing those words, Fox Queen looked furious. She swung her jade flute, and some sad sounds came at Isha. As this occurred, she hissed, How dare you? Han Sun knew something very bad was about to happen. He didn't say anything, and just maintained his hold on the bird's nest, moving toward the fallen white whale. Two deified beings were now having a fight. Ordinary creatures would not be able to endure the shockwaves. Han Sun didn't want to stay there and be reduced to dust. Fortunately, the white whale was ownerless now that Big King Bell had departed. Han Sun planned to hide inside and see if he could operate the thing. The white whale could block the attacks of a deified elite. Isha and Fox Queen had been unable to destroy its body. That thing must have been very tough. So if Han Sun was able to drive it, the whale would be far greater than a top-class battleship. When Fox Queen came for Han Sun, she had given up trying to bind the white whale. The white whale had fallen into the sea, and half of it was just floating atop the surface of the sea. The Blood Kirin dove, and took them into the water. Han Sun planned on going to the back door and making his way to the white whale's control room. As soon as he entered, he noticed that Crime and Mr. White had followed him. Boom! Han Sun was about to say something, But a scary sound cut him off. And then, the white whale suddenly flipped and started to sink. Many forces of horrible powers lashed the white whale, and each strike was like the crack of thunder. Fortunately, the big white whale was pretty solid. The shockwaves of combat coming from Isha and Fox Queen were not enough to break the hull. But even so, the impacts were driving it deeper into the sea. Boom! The whale shook under their feet, as if it had just hit something. And after that, they heard the sound of something large being destroyed. Then there was only silence. The white whale was no longer being tossed about. Looking out the white whale's eyes, they couldn't see anything except seawater and piles of rock. It looked as if the big white whale had been crushed under an enormous pile of rubble far below the surface. The sea around them was swirling like mad. Even though they were far enough underwater that they could hear the fight overhead, they still saw occasional shockwaves rolling through the water. The turbulence had, however, slowed down a lot. The white whale was now buried by the stone, and it could no longer move. That made Han-sun feel better, at least. This white whale is a machine. Crime looked around the control room in shock. The revelation had obviously caught him off guard. Mr. White was also looking about the big white whale with interest. Big King Bell, who wasn't the original owner, had been able to control the big white whale. Han-sun figured that Mr. White probably could as well. Anyone could control a machine like that, as long as it wasn't locked down. It should work on essentially the same principles as any other machine. Don't move it, Mr. White shouted, just as Han-sun was about to move the skeleton on the command chair. Han-sun stopped and waited as Mr. White and Crime came to the control deck. What have you learned, Mr. White? Han-sun asked politely. Mr. White looked at the skeleton and said, if I understand the situation correctly, this skeleton is the key that makes it possible to control the white whale. Han-sun was shocked. He had previously watched Big King Bell jump around on the platform, but he didn't think much of it since the bell was able to control the white whale. But Han-sun now saw the thing he had missed earlier. Big King Bell must have used the white whale for a long time, but the bell had never moved the skeleton. There must have been a reason for that. Mr. White, where do you think this technology came from? Han-sun asked Mr. White. Mr. White shook his head. This is the first time I have ever come across something like this. I don't know how to control it either. After pausing, Mr. White looked at the skeleton and said, but judging from its clothing, this person must have been connected to the control systems. His remains must be the key to controlling this entire machine. I cannot tell what might happen if we were to remove them. Han-sun examined the skeleton's clothes and started thinking. The skeleton's uniform was silver and black, and aside from the head, the entire body was wrapped up tight. It wore a transparent mask that was connected to the uniform. There was no visible seam. Han-sun spent some time observing it, and although he couldn't find a connection between the chair and the uniform, he thought the uniform and the white whale must have been linked somehow. Han-sun activated the purple eye butterfly to examine the uniform, the platform, and the chair. There were many powerful relics that the purple eye butterfly could tell Han-sun very little about. But if the item in question was some sort of technology, the purple eye butterfly was incredibly useful in revealing how it had been made and what its purpose was. When the purple eye butterfly rewound, Han-sun could see the entire process of the white whale's creation. What he witnessed gave Han-sun quite the surprise. Without a doubt, the white whale was one of the most powerful technologies to ever exist in the entire universe. The process of creating it had been very complicated. It was even harder to build than a deified weapon. It was doubtlessly so complicated because there was a lot of science involved. Every problem that arose with each individual part of the machine had to be solved through science. If Han-sun could analyze every facet of the white whale's technology, leveling up the Alliance's technological advancement would be easy. That wasn't the most shocking thing either. As Han-sun watched the construction of the white whale, he saw the shadow of the beetle. Although the white whale was more advanced than the beetle, the concept of their creation was similar. The white whale was just on a whole new level. The technology of the white whale, in every possible way, far exceeded that of the beetle. Every detail was better than the beetle's too. Is this crystallizer technology? Han-sun wondered in shock. The more he saw of the big white whale, the more accurate his guess seemed to be. Was the technology of the crystallizers ever this good? Could they make machines of a deified level? That's a very frightening idea, Han Sen mused. That would explain why the crystallizers challenged a higher race despite lacking deified elites of their own. Having such technology probably gave them the confidence to start a fight for a lantern. In the end, however, their arrogance and hubris had led to their failure and downfall. As a result, the race was almost entirely destroyed. What a shame! If the crystallizers had challenged a less powerful higher race, they could have definitely claimed a lantern. And then they would have developed even further. They would probably have become one of the top races in the universe. Han Sen sighed. But Han Sen then realized that if the crystallizers had become a higher race, they would have continued to develop their technology. They wouldn't have wanted to change their genes and blood pulse. They might never have experimented with their genes. And if that was so, humans would never have come into existence. Han Sen, you still have the relic, right? Mr. White asked Han Sr. Why are you asking me this? Han Sen looked at Mr. White. Mr. White smiled and said, I left a trace so that you could follow us. And that means I wish to continue our venture of cooperation. Before one of those two wins the fight above us, we should explore the holy town. What made you think I'd catch up with you? Han Sen asked Mr. White with a raised eyebrow. Because I believe in you, Mr. White said gently. Han Sen stared back at Mr. White. Han Sen hadn't believed that the two of them were very close. But Mr. White had just claimed to have an unbelievable amount of faith in him. He gazed into Mr. White's eyes and acknowledged the sincerity within them. This wasn't just another bargain for Mr. White. But for some reason, when Han Sen looked deep into Mr. White's eyes, he had a familiar feeling. It was as if they had already met a long time ago. That familiar feeling was only present for a single second. When he looked closely at Mr. White again, the man was like a stranger once more. He no longer seemed like anyone Han Sen already knew. Whatever Han Sen might have momentarily felt, Mr. White was of the Extreme King. Han Sen didn't know much about the Extreme King, all in all, and there was no one amongst them that he was actually close with. No one would ever claim that Mr. White was a close friend of his either. Thinking of this, Han Sen considered Mr. White's suggestion. To be honest, Mr. White's suggestion greatly tempted Han Senator after all. Han Sen wasn't entirely sure Isha could defeat Fox Queen in combat. And even if Isha won and continued traveling with him, he would have to share whatever treasure he found with her. They had a good relationship, and they were close enough to practically be considered family. But at the end of the day, their relationship was still built on the foundation that Isha had no clue Han Sen was the almighty dollar. If Isha found out that Han Sen was dollar, there was no telling what she might do. After all, dollar had not been kind to Isha. Han Sen decided to go ahead and explore the sacred leader's treasury with Mr. White. He didn't have to plan out everything in advance. He could betray whoever he needed to whenever he wanted to. He could take any item he required when the time to do so arose. If Han Sen needed to leave these two behind, he would do it without a second thought. It was a very business-like mindset. They were all striving for personal benefit, and they would only cooperate when they needed to use one another. Han Sen needed Mr. White to guide him safely to where the treasure lay. Mr. White needed the relic Han Sen carried. They were both using each other for their own purposes. And when Han Sen found the treasure, even if Han Sen didn't betray them, it was likely that Crime and Mr. White would be the ones betraying him. Of course, the most important thing was that Han Sen would be capable of betraying Mr. White. He just couldn't do that in front of Fox Queen and Isha. We don't have time to wait around. If there is a winner of that battle, neither of us will have the chance to explore that city, Mr. White said to Han Senator. Han Sen went silent. He looked at Mr. White and asked, You guys destroyed the 4th checkpoint. Did you find anything there? Han Sen cared about the item in the 4th checkpoint a great deal. There was a high chance that whatever item was retrieved there would prove useful when they reached the treasure. Mr. White went silent, then said, When Fox Queen destroyed the 36 stone pillars there, she found the jade flute inside the last pillar. That jade flute didn't belong to Fox Queen originally? Han Sun remembered that Fox Queen had been locked inside Ghost Bone's palace for the longest time. Han Sun had seen no evidence of the flute there, so why would she suddenly possess it now? It made sense that she had gotten it from the 4th checkpoint. But Han Sun was unable to see how the jade flute connected to the other checkpoints and the items they had yielded. Mr. White didn't say anything. He just waited for Han Sun to make a decision. Han Sun was thinking. He used a finger to point at the skeleton in the chair. This sea seems special. He dived into this deep sea with the intent of reaching its holy town. That is how he became like this in the first place. I know, Mr. White said simply. That is why we need the relic you have. It will allow us to reach the holy town safely. Okay. In that case, we will go and explore the holy town. Han Sun made his mind up. Han Sun didn't know where the holy town was, but Mr. White obviously did. Han Sun followed him in crime. They left the white whale and dove deeper, going so far under the sea that they reached the deep sea. The sea waves down there were incredibly strong. Clearly Fox Queen and Isha were still engaged in combat. It would take a long time for one of them to emerge victorious. Han Sun wasn't worried about Isha's well-being. With her abilities, even if she was unable to triumph over Fox Queen, he didn't think Fox Queen had what it took to kill Isha. And if Fox Queen couldn't defeat Isha, then he might as well head for the holy town. Han Sun had already learned of a way in which he could commandeer and pilot the white whale. But he saw no reason to use it just yet. Perhaps it would prove useful in the future. With Mr. White's guidance, Han Sun went deeper and deeper. The further they went, the quieter the sea became. The shockwaves Isha and Fox Queen were creating didn't reach those levels. If my calculations are correct, then the sacred leader's treasure should be someplace inside this trench. Mr. White pointed to a large underwater trench in front of him. Han Sun looked down into the trench and saw nothing but darkness. It was like a bottomless abyss. Even using the power of the purple-eye butterfly, he still couldn't see what lurked within. Without too much hesitation, though, Mr. White and Crime continued to swim down. Han Sun rode the blood Kirin after them. They all headed into the darkness of the deep trench. A little ways down, Han Sun felt as if something was amiss. The stone plate in his pocket started to burn. Han Sun pulled out the stone plate, and when he did, the plate glowed with a holy light. It lit up a small pocket of brightness amidst the suffocating dark of that place. Just as I thought. Only people who have the relic can enter the place that holds the true treasures of the sacred leader. Mr. White seemed to have expected this, and he eyed the stone plate as he spoke. The three of them and the beast continued to venture down. The water around them was very dark and creepy. No matter how strong their vision was, they could only see within the small pouch of light that the stone plate provided them. Everything else was pitch black. Nothing else could be seen, as if the entire world had gone black. They didn't know if this was the work of an illusion or not, but Han Sun could feel countless eyes peering at them from beyond the black. Time passed. Han Sun had no clue how deep they had dived by this point, but the trench was like a bottomless abyss. No matter how deep they went, there appeared to be no end. When he looked up, he found that it was pitch black above him too. The light couldn't penetrate the sea to such depths. They created small waves in the water as they swam, but there was no other movement. Isha and Fox Queen's fight didn't reach them at all anymore. Because it was too dark there, even the blood Kirin started to feel nervous. It kept releasing quiet moans and groans as it swam. Han Sun used his hands to stroke the blood Kirin's neck and bring it a bit of comfort. The blood Kirin had always been so moody and angry, and telling him to be quiet would be harder than making him bleed. Mr. White, however, looked calm. Crime was a little nervous, though. It looked like he was feeling the same fear as the blood Kirin. They felt as if they were being watched by phantom eyes in the dark. Han Sun knew for sure that something bad lurked out of sight. If it wasn't for his hands holding that relic, their small group would have already ended up like the master of the white whale. Suddenly, it looked like a blurry halo appeared around Han Sun's feet in the dark. He focused on that little halo, but the halo was too blurry, and he couldn't see it clearly. Mr. White and Crime also saw the halo. They looked down and checked it out. As their bodies descended, that blurry light became clearer and larger. When Hansen finally got a good look at what was in that halo, he opened his mouth. In that strange deep sea, everything around them was pitch black. But at the bottom of the ocean, there was a quiet city lying in the dark. The city was nestled in the darkness like a jewel. It glowed like a beacon of holy light. This underwater town was far different from the one Hansen had seen before. This holy town actually looked like a statue. All the buildings were pieces of a single structure. There were statues that were a few dozen stories high, and every brick was made of jade. The town looked like a jade statue that came from another world. What shocked Hansen the most was the shape of the giant underwater town. The statue was shaped like a sleeping beast with the end of its tail tucked under its head. And the face of the beast startled Hansen badly. The 9-life cat. Hansen almost screamed aloud. The town was shaped just like the 9-life cat pendant Hansen used to own. Aside from the white color of the town, it was just an incredibly large version of the 9-life cat pendant. When Hansen and the others approached the jade town, the town started to look bigger in their eyes. And when they touched the holy light coming from it, the stone plate's light suddenly exploded. Tiny cracks spread across the stone plate. Not long after, the stone plate crumbled away in Hansen's hands, leaving behind a crystal that had rested in the center of the tablet. The crystal was shaped like a water drop, and it rose into the water. It shone with a holy light. It left Hansen's fingers and drifted towards the jade town. Hansen reached his hand out to grab it, but the water drop crystal was too fast for him. Hansen snatched at empty water behind it. The crystal flew towards the cat statue's head. In the 9-life cat's forehead, there was a jade statue. The jade statue looked like a sleeping 9-life cat as well, although a smaller one. That 9-life cat statue's forehead had a water drop slot in it. It looked like the socket of a third eye. The crystal fitted itself perfectly into that water drop-shaped slot. The fit was so tight that it was practically seamless, and the 9-life cat statue suddenly looked complete. It then underwent some weird changes. The sleeping 9-life cat statue suddenly opened its eyes. It laid there lazily for a minute, and its paws moved to run its sleepy-looking cat eyes. It raised its head to look at Hansen and the others floating over the jade town. The three of them wondered if they should enter, but the 9-life cat suddenly raised its paw and waved at them like a lucky cat charm. They felt some irresistible power come upon them. All of them, including the blood Kirin, were then sucked into the jade town, as if by magnetic attraction. They used all their powers to resist the pull, but their efforts were in vain, and they were still pulled down anyway. Pang! 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 For loud booms rang out as they dropped into the town. They landed in front of a palace that stood before the jade cat statue. "Welcome to Holy Town, you poor guys." The 9-life cat statue was now looking at them from above. Its teeth were bared in something like a smile, but the face didn't seem to possess much mirth. The three of them looked at each other. They didn't know what this was all about, but they made sure to remain alert. They stared at the 9-life cat statue. "Don't be afraid. I am just a guardian spirit that protects the town. I will not hurt any of you." The jade cat still possessed that smile that wasn't actually a smile. Then the tone of its voice changed. "But since you guys are in the holy town, if you cannot pass the tests of the sacred leader, they will probably kill you. Why do we even have to accept your tests?" Crime asked coldly. Despite being a statue, the 9-life cat seemed to have no trouble thinking for itself. It smiled at Crime and said, "It is okay if you don't want to take the test. That means you give up, and you can die right now." Crime frowned. He started to say something more, but Mr. White stopped him. Mr. White looked at the jade cat statue and quietly asked, "What kind of tests are we expected to perform? And if we succeed, what will our rewards be?" The jade cat looked at Mr. White, smiled and said, "It is simple. Live. Live in the holy town. If you can survive for 10 days, you can win something from the sacred leader's surprise goodie bag. Good luck. Try not to die too soon." After the jade cat statue finished speaking, every palace and room across the town opened its doors. Many scary xenogeniacs began to slowly crawl out of their dens. The blood Kirin's scales straightened up like a dog raising its hackles. Its blood air rose. It growled in warning at the approaching creatures, but the growl warbled slightly, as if the blood Kirin was scared. The xenogenic beasts acted as if they hadn't heard the blood Kirin at all. All of them emerged from the palace and headed for the plaza. They approached without making any noise. They looked impassively at Han Sun, the blood Kirin, Mr. White in crime. So many xenogenics had emerged, and they were of a variety Han Sun knew little about. A few of them looked familiar, but even that familiarity was vague and undefined. There was a feathered creature with 6 golden wings, and a Ghana with draconic horns. But most of them were xenogenics Han Sun had never seen before. They moved slowly and steadily across the ground. The power of the creatures was overwhelming, and simply sensing their presence made Han Sun feel as if he was shouldering a mountain. A deified thunderbird, a deified sky spirit, a deified 6-winged gold angel, a deified Ghana dragon, Crime screamed. Every name Crime shouted out made Han Sun's heart feel worse and worse. Seeing the creatures had raised a lot of questions for Han Sun, but as Crime spoke, those questions died on his lips. All of the xenogenic beasts that were walking out of the palaces were deified. How is this possible? Han Sun was floored. There were around 100 of the xenogenics circling the plaza. With that many deified xenogenics, the entirety of the Geno universe could be conquered. Not even the combined might of the 3 most powerful races could fend off this army. Using such amazing power to conduct a mere test was like using a nuclear bomb to kill a mosquito. Not a mosquito, actually. Perhaps a flea. Or a mite. The combined power of these xenogenics could destroy the whole world. This is a trick. It has to be a trick. Maybe some kind of illusion. Sacred cannot have this many deified creatures. And even if they did, the creatures cannot all be here. Han Sun couldn't help but rub his eyes. He summoned his purple-eye butterfly to get a proper look at the beings in front of him. And when he did, Han Sun saw enough power to suppress every creature in the entire universe. When these creatures gathered together, they could destroy anything. Those xenogenic creatures had all the casual power of demon kings. Han Sun suddenly felt like a little girl entering the throne room of hell. He felt weak and vulnerable, while malicious eyes watched him from the dark. Han Sun wondered if Sacred Leader had played a joke on them. They were surrounded by so many deified xenogenics, and Han Sun had just recently become a duke. Not even the deified elites that Han Sun knew would have stood a chance against all the powerful xenogenics that had gathered. It's a trap. Han Sun couldn't think of any way he could fight off the amount of power that had been arrayed against him. Even if he refined 13 deified blood pulses, he would only gain their blood pulse abilities. His own level wouldn't ascend to deified status, and he would still most likely be killed. On top of that, he didn't have the time to refine another 12 deified blood pulses. Is the Jade Flute in Fox Queen's hands the key to getting through this? Perhaps there is a song that can be played to soothe and lull all of the deified xenogenics. It might subdue them without the need for fighting at all, Han Sun thought. It was pointless since they didn't have the flute though. Mr. White and Crime were just as shocked by the situation they had found themselves in. There was no way for them to run. They were surrounded by too many powerful xenogenics. Even if the ruler of the Extreme King came personally to save them, it wouldn't do any good. All of those scary creatures gathered in the plaza, and it became quite crowded as they filed in. The creatures watched the small group, and the weight of those eyes put fear into Han Sun, and even Mr. White. The deified xenogenics drew closer, pushing Han Sun and the others toward the center of the palace. There was no way to withdraw, and suddenly the Jade Cat coughed twice. Cough, cough. After the Jade Cat coughed, the deified xenogenics halted their advance. They did not get any closer to Han Sun, but they did not walk away, either. They simply remained where they were, staring expressionlessly at Han Sun's group. The Jade Cat looked at Han Sun and smiled. Don't be afraid. They will not attack you just yet. You guys have 1 day to travel anywhere in this city you desire. For this 1 day, they will not be permitted to bring you any harm. If you guys are still alive after 10 days, then you will have passed the test. We'll be hounded by 100 deified xenogenics. How are we expected to survive 10 whole days inside the city? Han Sun wanted to bargain for some better terms, The Jade Cat smiled. They are not really deified xenogeneics. They are just the clones of deified xenogeneics that Sacred Leader created. Each of them can only unleash a single deified attack. After one attack, they will die. So you guys still have a minuscule chance of surviving. Try your best. Oh, and right, I forgot to tell you guys. If you get into a fight with a deified xenogeneic clone, the others will back off. Only one can attack you at a time. The others won't interfere. Right. The test starts now. Try your best to survive. You have 1 full day to hide. You can hide anywhere you wish inside the holy town. The Jade Cat statue laid down after speaking, settling itself as if it was sleeping again. It looked like an ordinary jade statue. Han-sun could no longer sense any life force in it. Han-sun tried asking it a few more questions, but the Jade Cat statue did not respond. All that was left were the scary deified xenogeneic clones looking at them. Let's go. We only have 1 day. This is our one chance of surviving, Mr. White said. Then he stepped into the crowd of xenogeneics. The scary deified xenogeneics clones parted to form a path for him. The creatures wouldn't stop them from leaving. Han-sun followed Mr. White out of the plaza. 100 scary deified xenogeneics watched them walk away, but none of the creatures chased after them. Mr. White, do you have a plan that can help us escape this predicament? Han-sun asked. Mr. White shook his head. I am fairly sure that exiting the holy town is out of the question, to be honest with you. The only way we can get through the next 10 days is to hide somewhere that the deified clones cannot find us. But I doubt that the Sacred Leader created a game of hide-and-seek out of boredom. He must have some other purpose here. So, no matter where we hide, we can be sure that the xenogeneics will find us. Sir, what are you saying? Should we hide or should we not hide? Crime asked with confusion. Mr. White had described the results of both options, and neither one sounded good. Han-sun laughed. Mr. White explained it so clearly. We need to hide for 10 days, but even so we will be found. That suggests that there is only one way in which we can hide. And what way is that? Crime still didn't understand. Han-sun had no choice but to explain. Did the Jade Cat statue not tell you clearly enough? If we are fighting one xenogeneic, the others will leave us alone until the fight is finished. So we need to fight one sole xenogeneic for all 10 days. If we do that, the other xenogeneics might as well not even exist. I see. But how do we engage just one xenogeneic for that long? Didn't the Jade Cat statue say that the deified xenogeneics here are cloned? After one strike their bodies will break, Crime asked. That is something you will have to ask Mr. White about. Mr. White came up with the plan first. I am sure he's already thought of contingencies. Han-sun looked at Mr. White. I do have a few ideas, but ensuring our survival over the next 10 days will require the 4 of us to cooperate. Mr. White explained his plan. When Han-sun and Crime heard it, they thought the suggestion was way too risky. However, they couldn't think of any alternative courses of action, so they agreed to do it. The 4 of them didn't leave the plaza to hide. They tried to leave Holy Town just to see if they could, but after that, they went back to the plaza. Their day of waiting seemed to drag on and on. They could have spent the time hiding deep within the town, but they all knew that it would have been a pointless exercise. No matter how big Holy Town was, it was still just a town. The deified xenogeneics could use the power of their minds to scour the entire town for their prey. There were more than 100 deified xenogeneics there, so finding Han-sun's group would be easy. Mr. White's plan relied on using their single day of peace to prepare. What came next would be simple. Mr. White would familiarize himself with one of the deified xenogeneics, taking advantage of the creature's temporary docility to use his sealing techniques on it. Once he had sealed the deified clone's power, it wouldn't be able to use its deified strike. That way, they could draw out the fight to last for the entire 10 days. The deified xenogeneic would still be exceptionally strong, of course. Although only one strike needed to be sealed, it was a deified power. Mr. White could not seal the power by himself. He needed the combined might of Han-sun, the Blood Kirin, and Crime to help him complete the seal. The 3 of them resigned themselves to the plan. As long as they didn't attack the other deified clones, the clones would just stand there in the plaza and stare at them. Remember, My 4-symbol seal requires 4 people to function. So once the sealing begins, none of you can move. You have to keep sending power into the seal. If we lose anyone's power, the seal will break, Mr. White said seriously. Then he sent a wave of energy into Han Sun, Crime, and the Blood Kirin. Strange, new symbols of light appeared on their hands. The light symbol hummed on Han Sen's hand like an energy converter. When Han Sun sent power into the light symbol, his energy was transformed into sealing power. Green dragon, white tiger, red bird, and black turtle. 4 beasts made up the symbols, and Han Sun was represented by the red bird. As his power flowed into the symbol swirled around in his hand like a flaming bird. Mr. White stepped in front of one xenogeneic clone and directed Han Sun, Crime, and the Blood Kirin to stand on either side of and behind the creature. This was a powerful seal that normally required many people to do what they were attempting to. It wouldn't be an easy task in the midst of combat, that was for sure. Usually, a person would use this technique to seal a creature that was already under their control. The technique took far too long to be useful in a fight. Fortunately, the xenogeneic clone wasn't going to attack them during their free day. It stood there unmoving, increasing their chances of sealing it successfully. The first attempt went smoothly. Han Sun and the others surrounded the xenogeneic from 4 different directions. They weren't attacked, and the xenogeneic simply stood there looking at them. Mr. White waved at Han Sun and the others, indicating they should rest a little. It was still early in the day after all. If they fully committed to the sealing right then, they'd be wasting some of their strength. They needed to seal the creature at the last moment possible, in order to save every smidgen of energy they had. After a minute of thought, Han Sun said, "Since they aren't attacking us now, why don't we at least try the sealing to see if it works?" "You don't trust Mr. White? Even if the seal doesn't work, do you have another way out of this?" Crime asked in a cold voice. "There is nothing wrong with giving it a try," Han Sun responded flatly. Mr. White nodded. "Okay, then let us try. It will be a useful practice run." Following Mr. White's command, Han Sun and the others cast the 4-symbol seal. The symbol of the red bird shivered on Han Sen's hand. He felt a connection form between the bird and Mr. White's white tiger, Crime's black turtle, and the green dragon that hovered around the Blood Kirin's claws. All those powers were transferred, and the 4-symbol seal's light became stronger. The connection between them strengthened. The 4 powers supported each other, and as the light rose, 4 giant shadows formed into a bysema that trapped the creature inside. The xenogeneic found itself confined within the bysema. Its eyes flashed, and the enemy started to move. "Oh no! It is going to attack us! Seal the bysema now!" Mr. White shouted loudly. The 4 of them quickly finished casting the 4-symbol seal. The shadows of the green dragon, the white tiger, the red bird, and the black turtle were cast onto the xenogeneic's body. The shadows bound the xenogeneic. The xenogeneic kept moving as Han Sun, and the others continued casting their seal. The 4 shadows kept seething across the xenogeneic. The xenogeneic tried to fight back, but it couldn't break the seal. Crime looked ill, and he said, "I told you to trust Mr. White, but you just had to try it. Now we've wasted so much more of our power. What's done is done. We will just have to hold the seal and keep it going for the next 10 days, Mr. White said firmly, putting an end to Crime's complaining. Han Sun shrugged slightly and remained silent. He had known this was a possibility, but he thought they should give it a try anyway. Attempting the seal now would only anger one xenogeneic. If it failed, only one powerful creature would be trying to kill them. But if they failed closer to the end of the first day, they might end up being attacked by whole groups of the monsters. So Han Sun would rather spend a bit more energy now than risk everything later on. Aside from the struggling xenogeneic in the seal, the other xenogeneics just maintained their stances and their expressionless stares. When Han Sen's group confirmed that they weren't going to be attacked by the monsters around them, they felt greatly relieved. The xenogeneic kept struggling. Although its power was sealed, it still had a deified body. Han Sun and the others had to use all their power to hold the seal against the raw, physical strength of the creature's thrashing. Mr. White and the Blood Kirin were half deified, so they had an easier time. Crime was a top dog of the kings, so he was holding up well too. But Han Sun had only just become a duke. He hadn't been a duke for very long, so his power was lacking in comparison to the others. He had to use all of his strength, just to keep the red bird symbol of light up. Mr. White looked at Han Sun and said, "A duke's element is separate from your original body's astral body and celestial body. Your original body is your own genes taking the form of an element. At that stage, you must use your own power to fight. At the second stage, your astral body needs to rely on the planet beneath you. Planetary powers can be used to aid the elements of your body. For instance, a water element duke will perform much better on a water-based planet." After pausing, Mr. White continued to say, "The celestial body you can access in the third stage is also known as your universal body. That body can use the power of the universe. As long as it is not separated from the universe for some reason, it has access to practically unlimited power." Han Sun understood what Mr. White was talking about, but he had only just become a duke. He only had his original body, so he couldn't make use of any external powers. Plus, even if he did gain a celestial body, he knew that Holy Town was separated from the outside world. He couldn't access any power that was outside the town. Mr. White knew what Han Sun was thinking, and so he smiled. "Judging by the way you use your body, you must still be at the first stage. You only have your original body. I have an original body geno art that might be able to help you. Perhaps you could learn it in order to ascend more easily. If you are really willing to teach me, I would be very grateful." Han Sun was surprised. He hadn't expected Mr. White to volunteer to teach him a geno art, and he wasn't sure what the sudden offer meant. "Mr. White, why do you care about him?" Crime exclaimed unhappily. Mr. White smiled. "We are cooperating to maintain the seal, aren't we? We are all in this together. Han Sun is of a lower level than us, so he will have a hard time over the course of the next 10 days. If anything happens to him, we will all be destroyed. I am only doing this for myself." After Mr. White said that, Crime fell silent. Mr. White paused for a moment before speaking. "My geno art isn't very impressive. I made it myself, and I never did think up a name for it. It hasn't been presented anywhere. I'll explain it as best I can, and if you think it helps, you can use it. If it doesn't, that's okay. Please tell me," Han Sun said. In a quiet voice, Mr. White gave a straightforward explanation of the geno art. Crime and the Blood Kirin focused on his words as well. Crime listened seriously. Just like Mr. White said, his geno art seemed rather simple. Even so, it was obviously quite special. Despite its simplicity, it was incredibly difficult to understand. "Mr. White, your geno art is so complicated. I am afraid he won't be able to understand it," Crime said after hearing Mr. White's geno art. "I don't think I really understand. Please explain it to me again," Han Sun said, trying to keep his shock from showing on his face. Truthfully, Han Sun understood the geno art perfectly. The geno art was quite familiar to him, and that familiarity shook him to his core. The geno art had an obvious connection to the Dongxian Sutra. Both arts could benefit each other quite well, and using Mr. White's technique could aid in the development of the Dongxian Sutra. Han Sun could use the Dongxian Sutra to absorb power from the world around him. Doing so allowed him to conserve his own energy, stretching his strength out over a longer period of time. But the Dongxian Sutra had yet to reach Duke, so the effect wasn't particularly good. It only saved Han Sun a small amount of power. Has Mr. White realized that I used the Dongxian Sutra? Is that why he's telling about this geno art? What is he planning? Han Sun thought fast, but he didn't have enough information to guess what Mr. White was playing at. It seemed likely that Mr. White knew that Han Sun could use the Dongxian Sutra. Explaining a geno art as simply as he had suggested that the man's mind was quite frightening. It put Han Sun on red alert. "If you don't mind me repeating myself, I will recite the geno art again." Mr. White smiled. Then he resumed talking about the geno art. It would have been better if he had stopped speaking there, for the more he talked, the more confused Crime became. Mr. White's detailed explanation of the Geno art was more difficult to understand than the Geno art itself. He began speaking about the Geno universe itself, which was something Crime had never heard about before. Han Sun used the Dongxian aura to listen, and he was able to understand a bit. He pretended that he couldn't though, and he feigned confusion. Mr. White, I'm afraid that the explanation isn't helping. I am just getting more and more confused. Han Sun presented Mr. White with a wry smile. Mr. White is so smart. Since you're just a duke, well, it is only expected that you can't understand a word that he's saying. And don't worry, I don't understand either. It isn't about you, okay? Crime said. Mr. White shook his head and sighed. The things I have learned are a bit different from your own Geno art. It is okay that you don't understand, but try to learn as much as you can, for I can only explain it here like this. Thank you for your willingness to teach me. I'm just afraid I will never be able to learn such a Geno art, Han Sun said. But he was secretly casting the Geno art Mr. White had just taught him. He gave it a try, and it worked fine. When Han Sun didn't summon his Dongxian armor, the effect of absorbing external power seemed to increase. And this was Han Sun's very first time using the ability. If the ability was already useful, then it would surely become a greater and greater benefit to him, as his proficiency increased. Han Sun still didn't know why Mr. White had given him the Geno art, but he was okay with learning something new. Han Sun practiced it, and the strain of maintaining the 4 symbols seal decreased. The day went by pretty quickly. After the first 24 hours, the other deified xenogeneic clones shifted slightly toward Han Sun, and the others like the very hungry monsters that they were. The monsters stared at them for a whole day, and the beasts' eyes were different than they had been. There was a fresh, murderous gleam in their eyes. The scary creatures looked over them, as if deciding which flavor of meat to dine on first. The slavering beasts made Han Sun and the others nervous. But even so, despite all the attention directed toward them, not a single one of the xenogeneics prepared to attack. They just stared at Han Sun's group like jewels. Acknowledging their apparent safety, Han Sun and the others felt relieved. It was fortunate that the jade cat statue hadn't lied to them. The deified clones really were restraining themselves, as the cat statue had said. Han Sun and the others didn't dare move though. They continued using their strength to keep the Bysema going. They kept the deified xenogeneic clone sealed, hoping they could hold the creature there for the entire 10 days. But as time ticked by, the xenogeneic clone's struggling became worse and worse. After it had been thrashing around for a while, Han Sun started to feel a strain. 5 days later, even the half-deified blood Kirin was beginning to fatigue. Because each part of the 4 symbol seal was connected, Han Sun didn't have to continually use his full power. It meant that the others had to pick up his weight, though, to keep the deified xenogeneic suppressed. So the blood Kirin and Mr. White were using up a lot more power than Han Sun was. Sweat began to trickle down Crime's forehead. It was getting hard for him too. Things were not going as well as they had hoped. But by Han Sun's estimation, if they continued using power at the same rate, they would survive all 10 days of the trial. Little guys, you seem to be working very hard. I have to say, you're not doing a bad job. Suddenly, the jade cat statue started talking again. It spoke lazily though, as if it had just woken up from a deep slumber. Han Sun and the others were concentrating all their strength on maintaining the 4 symbols seal however. They couldn't spare the time or effort to bother looking in the direction of the jade cat statue. The jade cat statue's voice came from behind them again. You guys are doing good, but don't you think that this would be a boring way to pass the test? You aren't going to cheat, are you? Han Sun's heart jumped. If the jade cat statue let the rest of the xenogeneics attack them, they would be very dead. The jade cat statue laughed and said, "Don't worry. I cannot change the rules that sacred leaders set in place. I just wanted to give you a small surprise." I hate surprises, Han Sun said with a tight feral smile. But this really is a surprise. It might actually prove to be a great benefit to you guys. Of course, you will need to have what it takes to accept the surprise. The jade cat statue looked as if it was smiling, but it wasn't. After the cat statue's voice trailed off, Han Sun heard a noise coming from the ground. It sounded like something was dragging metal chains. Han Sen scanned around them with his Dongxian aura. And then he noticed as all the deified clones began stepping away from them. Something new was approaching Han Sen's group. It was a skeleton. Or at least, it looked like a skeleton. The flesh of the creature had dried into a withered husk. Its long hair was like tufts of hay. The being wasn't dead though. His limbs were bound by metal cuffs, and he walked very slowly. With every step the man took, chains grated across the ground behind him. The chained man was approaching them with his head lowered. When he got closer, Han Sen could see that there were 2 dark holes where his eyes should have been. Dark blood wept from the holes, and the eyes were missing. Han Sen and the others looked grim. They were using their powers to cast the 4 symbols seal. If the creepy man attacked them, they wouldn't be able to block the strike without releasing the 4 symbols seal. And that would be enough to lead to their doom. The prisoner came within 10 meters of them, chains rasping across the ground with every step. He raised his head so that the 2 bloody holes could peer at Han Sen and the others. Those 2 holes gave them the willies. He stopped for a moment, but then, the prisoner started to move again. His slow steps took him toward Han Sr. What the fuck? Han Sen thought frantically. There were 4 of them. But the prisoner had decided to go for Han Senator. It was getting closer. And after another minute, it stood right behind him. The prisoner approached Han Senator although he walked slowly. He was already very close to them. A second later, he was directly behind Han Senator as the prisoner walked. His cuffs clinked and clanked. When he came to a stop behind Han Sen, he fell completely silent. Han Sen couldn't even hear the prisoner breathing or his heart beating. It was as if he no longer existed. Han Sen used his Dongxian aura to scan the prisoner, but he was shocked to find that he could no longer detect the prisoner's presence. Goosebumps flared across Han Sen's body. The prisoner was standing directly behind him, but he could not feel the strange chained man. His inability to detect the creature deeply unsettled Han Senator. He wanted to just run away as fast as he could. But he was currently casting the red bird spell. If he left his position, then the 4 symbols seal would break. If any of the 4 tried to run, they'd all end up dead. The bird's nest still sat on Han Sen's head. He forced himself not to turn around, and he thought to himself, "So what if you are behind me? You can't break this bird's nest. I have nothing to be afraid of." Han Sen stood where he was and did not move. He did not dare turn and look behind him. He continued to cast his powers through the red bird spell to keep the trapped xenogeniac suppressed. But when Han Sen looked at Mr. White and the others, he was given a shock. Mr. White's face looked strange, but Han Sen couldn't accurately read the man's expression. Crime's expression was easier to interpret though. He was in massive shock. He stared behind Han Sen with wide eyes, as if he had seen a ghost. The Blood Kirin's response was even more dramatic. It was growling at Han Sen, as if in an urgent warning. What is he doing behind me? Han Sen's heart felt chilled. He still couldn't detect the presence behind him. It was as if the chained man wasn't actually a creature at all, but some specter of death itself. Mr. White gulped. He looked pale, but still he didn't say a word. His expression made Han Sen even more worried. Han Sen could no longer help it, so he moved his head to take a look. He couldn't turn his head very far though, because if he moved his hands or body, he could disrupt the casting. After twisting his head to the left, he saw nothing. Then he looked right. And still, he couldn't see anything. Han Sen wished he could just twist his body around, so he could properly see what the prisoner was doing. But he really couldn't move his body. Han Sen couldn't keep his eyes off the others' horrified expressions though. Their vision lingered on the space behind Han Sen, which made his heart tremble in fear. Fuck you. I have a bird's nest to protect me, and I have nothing to be afraid of. Han Sen gritted his teeth and did not move. But suddenly, Han Sen felt a chill run down his neck. It felt as if something was blowing a cold breath over his neck. Han Sen's skin prickled as his back turned sore, and his legs went soft. Han Sen had seen many scary things in his lifetime, so he didn't frighten easily. But not being able to see the prisoner was deeply disturbing. He felt a deep chill in his heart. Don't move, Mr. White called to Han Sr. What is he doing behind me? Han Sen asked, his voice tense. It was a shame that the blood Kirin couldn't speak. If it had been able to talk, Han Sun would have asked it. Crime wasn't trustworthy enough for Han Sun to bother asking him though. This is hard to explain. Mr. White frowned, and he looked poorly. It seemed as if he didn't know what to say. Seeing Mr. White's hesitation made Han Sun frown. He had no clue what was going on behind him. If Han Sun was in danger, Crime and Mr. White probably wouldn't want to tell him, because they wouldn't want to risk Han Sun moving and breaking the four symbols seal. However, Han Sun didn't think that was the reason for their behavior. If Han Sun was attacked and wounded, then the four symbols seal would break anyway. They wouldn't stay silent and tell him not to move. If there is no actual danger, then why can they not tell me what's wrong? Han Sun wondered. Han Sen's attempts to figure out what was happening were getting him nowhere. But his back felt colder and colder. His worry continued to deepen. Mr. White and Crime were still staring at the space behind him. The blood Kirin kept growling at Han Sun, as if it wished to tell him something. Han Sun could no longer resist the temptation. He summoned Bauer and asked her to take a look at the prisoner behind him. Bauer appeared on Han Sen's shoulder. Han Sun spoke to her. Bauer, help your daddy take a look at what this thing is doing behind him. Bauer nodded. She leaned over his shoulder and took a look behind him. She jerked in surprise and said, Dad, behind you. What is behind me? Han Sun quickly asked. There is a man drawing on your back, Bauer said after thinking. Drawing? Han Sen's mind went blank for a minute. He was confused, and so he thought. The prisoner is drawing something on my back? Is he an artist? Does he love drawing on humans? Is my body too good? And he could not help but use my fine figure for a canvas? No way. If he was fond of drawing on bodies, then he should have gone and found a pretty girl to paint upon. Why bother drawing on me? Bauer, what is he drawing? Han Sun quickly asked. Something else had to be going on here. Bauer leaned further over Han Sen's shoulder, peering at Han Sen's back, but she didn't speak. Bauer, what is he drawing? Han Sun squeaked. He wasn't scared, he told himself. He just didn't like it. Bauer hesitated, but she eventually said, It's like the creature is drawing a person. Yeah, a woman. A woman? What kind of woman? Han Sun was frozen. A skeletal prisoner had appeared out of nowhere, slinked up to his back, and started drawing a woman on him. This was too fucking creepy, and it made Han Sun feel itchy and uncomfortable. Bauer didn't seem to know how she might describe what she saw. With hesitation she said, An ugly, ugly woman. Han Sun felt his pulse pounding in his temples. An ugly prisoner was now drawing an ugly woman on his back. What the fuck was happening? Han Sen's mouth was wide open. He tried to ask another question, but he had no idea what he should ask. Bauer observed his back some more, and then she said, Dad, he cannot draw anymore. Why? Han Sun asked curiously. Bauer responded quickly this time. The blood of the woman coming from his hands is running dry, and there is no more paint left. What? He is using a woman's blood to draw on my back. Han Sun felt as if his head was going to explode. He could not imagine the scene behind him. Dad, the woman has no more blood. Dad, he cracked open the woman's brain. Bauer kept reporting what was happening. Bauer, stop looking. Han Sun called Bauer back into his arms. He didn't want her to see such a bloody scene. Bauer was actually quite old at this point, but in Han Sen's eyes, she'd be a little girl forever. Bauer jumped off of Han Sen's shoulder to sit on his chest. She looked curiously at the four symbols seal, and the trapped xenogeniac that was still struggling inside. Han Sun still couldn't feel anything behind him, but after hearing what Bauer had said, he felt sick with worry. The images of what she had described kept repeating inside his mind, and nothing he tried to think about could scrub them away. Jade Cat, what are you doing? Han Sun finally shouted at the statue of the Jade Cat. The Jade Cat already seemed to be sleeping again, and it showed no reaction to Han Sen's call. After a while, the prisoner's chains began to rattle again. As it left the space behind Han Sen's back, it slowly entered his field of vision. The prisoner left in pretty much the same manner that he arrived, slowly and seemingly vacant-minded. There was one small difference, however. He was dragging the corpse of a woman behind him. To be more accurate, That was not the body of a woman. It was a female creature's body. Han-sen couldn't see what the female creature's facial features had been, because a large hole had been punched into the creature's head. There was a gaping cavity where the face had been. The upper part of her body was humanoid, though, and the lower body was like a snake. She looked like one of the Ghana, but unlike the Ghana, there was a spiraling horn on her head. It was silver and around 1 foot long, and it was reminiscent of a unicorn's horn. The snake scales of her lower body were silver as well. They were so bright that they made her form seem a little transparent. Holes had been torn through her head and chest, but there was no blood oozing out. It was just as Bauer had originally said, in that the blood of the woman had run dry. What is that weirdo's presence here supposed to mean? Why would he draw a woman on my back? Han-sen wondered, somewhat shaken. But Han-sen didn't seem to be injured or impaired. His body was fine, his galactic lobster armor was fine, and it looked like the creepy prisoner guy was leaving now that he had drawn his picture. Although the whole experience had been rather disturbing, the creature hadn't actually hurt him. So, Han-sen knew he'd just have to stop thinking about it. Bauer, could you use some water to wash your dad's armor? Wash away the mess he made, Han-sen said to Bauer. While the paint hadn't been harmful, he was still unhappy to have it on him. Bauer jumped off of Han-sen's chest and walked behind him to do as he asked. Then her surprised voice said, "She is gone." "What is gone?" Han-sen's heart jumped into his throat. "The picture he drew is now gone," Bauer said. "How could it be gone?" Han-sen was very confused about this, and so he proceeded to ask, "Did the picture just get smeared?" Bauer shook her head. "Dad, there's nothing on your back. It is very clean, and there is not even the smallest semblance of a bloodstain. The ugly woman drawing is all gone." Han-sen had no idea what to make of this, so he asked Mr. White, "Mr. White, what is going on?" Mr. White shook his head. "I don't understand any of this either. We couldn't see your back, and we were only able to see that he was drawing something on you. I don't know what it was that he actually drew." Han-sen didn't like not knowing, but there was little that he could do about it. He checked his body and noted how nothing seemed to have happened, so for now, he shelved all thoughts about it. Nothing strange happened after that. The four of them kept sending power into the four symbols seal. It maintained a firm hold on the snared xenogeneic clone. Days passed, and after what felt like forever, they reached the 10-day deadline. Although the four of them were quite exhausted by this point, they had at least managed to survive the 10 days. When the xenogeneics returned to their palace lairs, and the doors of their palaces closed, the four of them almost collapsed. The jade cat statue smiled and began speaking again. "Congratulations! You have passed the Sacred Leader's test. You can now receive the relic left behind by the Sacred Leader." "Where is the treasure?" Han-sen asked, forcing himself to ignore his exhaustion. "Right here," the jade cat statue said. The jade pillar below its feet then suddenly opened up, revealing a small jade box. It was impossible to guess what might lay inside. Han-sen started forward to pick up the box, but then, his heart jumped up. He saw that Crime was holding a broken sword, slashing towards Han. Senator the Blood Kirin was angered by this, and so it roared and leaped towards Crime. But Crime's darkness covered everything, and Han-sen's eyes were unable to pierce it. Han-sen didn't move his eyes though. The bird's nest was still on his head, and he leaped towards where the box had been before everything went black. In Crime's area-off effect, all 7 of Han-sen's senses were blocked. But because he had the protection of the bird's nest, he wasn't concerned about any attacks that Crime might launch. But the next second, Han-sen's face changed. A weird power came down to strike the bird's nest. The power locked onto the bird's nest and pulled it away from Han-sen's head. Then he and Bauer were tied up by something like a rope. The rope jerked them roughly to the side. The darkness faded. Han-sen noticed that he and Bauer were now bound by loop upon loop of white rope. Next to them, there was a net with Han-sen's bird's nest inside it. The net must have been quite special if it was able to bind a deified bird's nest. Crime held the net in one hand, and the jade box in the other. "Thank you for helping me obtain the Sacred Leader's treasure," Crime said coldly to Han-sen, holding the box casually under one arm. "Who are you?" Mr. White frowned at Crime. Crime smiled and said, Mr. White, I am your faithful guard Crime. You look like Crime, but Crime is just a king-class guard. You most certainly aren't. Crime wouldn't possess Prince 14's Skynet, Mr. White stated flatly, his frown deepening. Crime slid the box into his chest pocket. Then, he lifted his broken knife and spoke to Mr. White. You think too much. Although I am half deified, I am still your guard. But aside from you, I have a duty to Prince 14 as well. Prince 14 wants this item, so I will have to take this back with me. Mr. White, we both work for Prince 14. You have helped me a great deal, and I will tell Prince 14 of your involvement. But this is not where this should be discussed. We need to get rid of him first, Crime said. Then his broken knife came swinging towards Han Sr. Crime swung his weapon, and the substance chain on his knife became a black snake king that looked as if it could swallow the sky. It suddenly lashed towards Han. Senator Han Sen's body surged with power, but the white rope tightened around him. The mysterious substance chain tangled him up, and it made it difficult for Han Sen to gather up any semblance of defense. That knife was going to slice him to ribbons. Han Sen gritted his teeth. He was preparing to activate his Super God Spirit mode when the roaring knife light was broken. Han Sen was shocked. He looked at Crime. A hand that looked like jade had wrapped around Crime's wrist. The fingers were very long and pretty. Mr. White. Han Sen could not believe what his own eyes were seeing. Mr. White was standing behind Crime, pulling his hand back through Crime's chest. But Mr. White's hand emerged perfectly clean, without a speck of blood dirtying it. Crime's broken knife fell to the ground. He looked at the bloody hole in his chest, and then looked at Mr. White with disbelief. He said, "Your power was said to be useless in a fight. How? How were you able to destroy my black lion body? Life is full of surprises. You should have gotten used to that by now." A beautiful white shell appeared in Mr. White's hand. He opened it and held it out toward Crime. The injured Crime was sucked into the shell. When the shell closed up, Mr. White pocketed it. He grabbed the Skynet and the little box. He looked as if he was smiling, but he wasn't. And to Han Sen he said, "Han Sen, it looks like you have lost completely." Han Sen was still bound by the Skynet. He gave Mr. White a wry smile. "You won. So, what are you going to do with me?" "Kill you, of course. Do you really think I'd let a scary enemy like you continue to live and grow in this world?" Mr. White looked at Han Sen emotionlessly. "Mr. White, you overestimate me. I am just a nameless soldier." Han Sen didn't move. He summoned all his power as he continued to stare at Mr. White. He was going to take a risk. Mr. White turned to the cat statue as he gripped the Skynet, ignoring Han Sen and Bauer. "Nine-life cat, can we go now?" Han Sen was shocked. Mr. White knew the jade cat statue was a nine-life cat. The nine-life cat statue stared at Mr. White. It remained unmoving as it coldly said, "If you guys pass the test, so it is entirely up to you whether you come or go. There is no need to ask for my permission. Goodbye." Mr. White tugged the Skynet and dragged Han Sen and Bauer out of Holy Town. This time, the power of the town didn't prevent them from leaving. Mr. White pulled Han Sen and Bauer out of the town with ease and returned to that area of dark water. Mr. White's other hand glowed with holy light as it held the jade stone box. The light was able to keep the darkness at bay, at a distance of around 3 meters from them. He eventually pulled Bauer and Han Sen safely out of the trench. Han Sen had thought Mr. White would kill them in Holy Town, but he didn't. And after he left that place, he didn't try to make a quick getaway. He took Han Sen and Bauer into the big white whale instead. Fox Queen and Isha's fight seemed to have ended, since there was no more movement in the sea. It was unclear which of the two might have emerged victorious though. There was no sign of either of them. Mr. White brought Han Sen and Bauer into the big white whale. He smiled and looked at Han Sr. "Now I can kill you without any worries. Have you thought up any escape ideas? Why didn't you kill me in Holy Town?" Han Sen asked with confusion. "You really think that town hid the real treasure?" Mr. White asked in an amused tone. "It didn't." Han Sen asked. "It could have, but only if the sacred leader went mad." It would have taken utter insanity to spend so much power and effort constructing a place to hide his own treasure. Mr. White smiled. This place must have a secret that you haven't even imagined yet. Aside from that, the picture on your back looks pretty special. I thought the drawing was gone. Han-sun was shocked. Mr. White laughed and said, "You are too naive. Just because something disappears, that doesn't mean it is gone. I didn't recognize the person who drew on you, but I do know that he was drawing a creature known as Ancient Blood Dragon Lady. It is a mutant deified xenogeneic. Her blood is her mutant xenogeneic gene. I don't think such powerful blood could disappear so easily." Han-sun heard this and was shocked. He had never thought that thing might have been a mutant deified creature. Why? Why did he draw on me? Han-sun asked in confusion. I do not know. Perhaps ever since the beginning, you were the chosen one. Mr. White's expression hardened. But it doesn't matter anymore. I am going to kill you, so everything will end. After that, Mr. White looked angry. He yanked the Skynet, and Han-sun and Bauer were pulled in front of him. His hand reached out to grab Han. Senator Han-sun remembered how Crime's body was easily perforated by Mr. White's hand. He was shocked, and he was about to activate his super god body. But when Mr. White waved his hand, the Skynet loosened enough to release the bird's nest. The bird's nest returned to Han Sr. Mr. White, this is... Han-sun caught the bird's nest, and he looked at Mr. White with confusion. Mr. White put away the Skynet, and he tossed the jade box towards Han. Senator Han-sun caught the little jade box, his confusion growing. He had no idea what was going on. Mr. White smiled at Han. Senator. His muscles and bones began to shift and writhe, and so too did his face. Not long after, Mr. White became someone else. His presence was greatly changed. Mr. White now looked younger. He looked no more than 20 years old, but his body carried a special sort of presence. It gave Han-sun the feeling that this man had seen and lived through everything. He was like a person that oversaw a match of chess. Han-sun's mouth opened wide. You? How is it you? Han-sun screamed, pointing at him. Why would it not be me? Mr. White looked at Han-sun with interest. Aren't you in the sanctuaries? How? How did you get out? Han-sun spoke only half of what he wished to. He then suddenly thought of Blood Legion and the Shura, who both had a way to leave. It now didn't seem so strange that this person had been able to leave the sanctuaries. It is a long story. To summarize, I thought I'd be able to break the vacuum and become a god in this world. But who knew that this was the place I would actually come to? It was quite a disappointment all in all. Mr. White shrugged, looking regretful. I cannot believe it. Han-sun mumbled, still frozen. Han-sun knew this man. They hadn't spent much time together, but Han-sun remembered him. That was because this man was the real heir of the Xian men. But Han-sun had only learned the Dongxian Sutra from Dongxianzi. That counted for half of the Xian men students. Han-sun looked at that man, who was similar to his age. He coughed awkwardly and hesitantly asked, So, what should I call you? In the past, Han-sun had received a secret Xian men skill from the man. But the man said he wasn't going to take any students. And Han-sun was also able to obtain Dongxianzi's legacy. He didn't know which of the two was a more important figure. The man laughed and said, Names are merely symbols. When someone practices as much as I have, they've already given such titles up. You should just keep on calling me Mr. White, to make sure that my identity within the Extreme King doesn't get exposed. You are going back to the Extreme King? Han-sun asked with surprise. Mr. White smiled and said, The Extreme King isn't some scary hole for beasts to fester in. There are many resources to obtain. To be fair, it is a fine place to continue with one's practice. Why wouldn't I go back? Then how are you going to explain what happened here? Han-sun asked, holding up the little box. Crime was dead, and Mr. White had given the box to Han. Senator Han-sun was afraid that if he returned, he would be unable to report to Prince 14. Everything will work itself out, if given the time. Use your heart. Think here and see. Hold on to everything you can in this world. There is a solution to each and every woe. After that, Mr. White gave Han-sun a card. This is what I have been thinking about over all these years. You can take a look, but remember, do not put the stock of your belief too deeply into anything. You still need to form your own opinions on things in this life. A portion of the real Xianmen requires one to practice with the faith of their own heart. I have no time to take care of it. My Xianmen legacy has probably come to an end on this day. You count as half of the Xianmen members. I hope that in the future, you will find a way to continue the teachings of the Xianmen and pass on my techniques. You don't need to ask anyone to join the Xianmen formally, but the Xianmen will be lucky enough just to have one or two out there that have really devoted themselves to the learnings. Han Sen did not reject the plea. He gladly accepted the card he was given. He knew Mr. White wasn't too personally invested in all of this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have given Han Sen Xuantian's secret skill before. There were many religions and parties working in the world, but most religions only taught a person what to do and what to believe in. Only Xianmen taught a person how to explore and find their own understanding of the world, their own connection within the workings of the universe. So, it would be very difficult for the Xianmen to become famous. It wasn't explicitly defined, so it couldn't compete on the same wavelength as other teachings and religions. That was because this teaching confused people. Most people wanted to be comforted. They wanted something to guide them through the hardships of life. But Xianmen was about having to think about things yourself. You had to take charge of your own fate and explore the unknown. The future was full of unknowns and variables. It was tough. People that didn't have the required intelligence or endurance could never make it through. So it wasn't beyond belief that Xianmen fell into oblivion. The road of Xianmen was not one that many would willingly choose. After Mr. White spoke, he looked at the little box in Han Sen's hand. He said, "If my assumptions about the box are correct, then it doesn't actually contain the sacred leader's treasure. It is just a red herring. The real treasure still resides someplace in Holy Town. But our combined strength still isn't enough to explore all of that town's secrets. When we have both become deified, we can return and resume exploration of the town." "Mr. White, what is the picture upon my back?" Han Sen still felt nervous when he thought about that painting. It was way too weird. Mr. White thought for a moment, then said, "Ancient blood dragon lady's blood was used as ink. A picture was drawn upon your back. I couldn't see the picture, and so I can't make a sound assertion. But do not worry, as I have made some calculations of the future on your behalf. Following a terrible incident, there were still some good fortunes to be had. Whatever that picture was, it wasn't a bad thing. Good fortune following something terrible? That means something terrible is going to happen." Han Sen was shocked. Mr. White laughed and said, "You're in for a rough ride. It would be nice if you didn't tell me these things so bluntly." Han Sen gave a wry smile. Mr. White quietly said, "When you follow Isha back to Narrow Moon, you should be prepared. I believe that the Extreme King will eventually summon you to their ruler's kingdom." Han Sen was curious, so he had to ask, "Mr. White, how did you end up becoming part of the Extreme King?" Mr. White quietly said, "I disguised myself as a hybrid of the Extreme King, so I could stay among them. I was drawn to their resources, but I also learned something very interesting there. I stayed so I could find out more about it." "What was it?" Han Sen asked again. "We humans have the Extreme King's blood pulse gene. Although it is only a small smidgen of the stuff, it does exist. And that is how I was able to successfully pass myself off as one of the Extreme King without being discovered," Mr. White said. "I guessed as much." Han Sen nodded. He had considered this possibility before. And if Mr. White had followed the same line of thought, there was no reason to believe he was incorrect. Mr. White continued to say, "When the Extreme King become king class, they can awaken their king body. The king bodies are very similar to the super god bodies we have in the sanctuaries. There's one primary difference, however. Our super god bodies are independent, while their king bodies are not independent." "What do you mean?" Han Sen didn't understand. Mr. White groaned and went on to explain. "What I mean to say is that our super god bodies are a part of us. Their king bodies seem to have a connection with the outside world and some mysterious power. I am still investigating it. There are so many questions I have been unable to find answers for. I cannot explain everything." After chatting with Han-sun, Mr. White said, I should go. If you head left when you leave, you should soon come across Isha. Mr. White left, but Han-sun didn't go after Isha just yet. He walked over to the skeleton sitting in the command chair of the white whale. He took off the clothes that were on the skeleton, and then he put the skeleton in a box. He planned on finding a good place to bury the man when he returned. It was a crystallizer. It was like someone of the same race. After thoroughly cleaning the pieces of clothing, Han-sun put them on. He put the transparent eye patch on his head, and he felt as if his thoughts were spreading. His body and his vision expanded. That feeling could not be explained. It was like the whale was becoming a part of his body. Waves of information rolled through eye patch and were downloaded into his mind. To put it simply, Han-sun could now use his mind to control the white whale. Piloting the machine was as simple as using his own body. Han-sun guided the big white whale to the left, and there he found Isha. Isha was swimming through the sea. She saw the big whale and surged towards it. Han-sun quickly jumped out of it to prevent any misunderstandings. My queen, where is Fox Queen? Han-sun asked. Isha shook her head. She escaped. Then we should get out of here too. I got the item from Holy Town. Let's leave now. Han-sun then piloted the white whale out of the Holy Spirit Sea with Isha. When they reached the maze, Han-sun put away the whale. The enormous whale really was just like the beetle. It could shrink with its space technology. It shrank until it disappeared into the eye patch. It was like a little whale placed inside a bottle, and it looked magical. Isha and Han-sun returned to the base of the Ice Blue Knights, where they ran into Ice Blue Night King. It was fairly obvious that he had been unable to navigate the palace maze, and had thus decided to return. When he saw Isha and Han-sun come back together, Ice Blue Night King's eyes widened. Knife, I am so glad to learn that you are still alive, Ice Blue Night King said, coming up to her. I'm afraid that my survival might not be a good thing for you, Isha growled. Ice Blue Night King frowned. Isha, what makes you say that? I am alive. That means no one is allowed to bully my student. Do you understand now why that might not be a good thing? It would have been better for you if I had remained dead, Isha said, her voice as hard as stone. Ice Blue Night King fidgeted awkwardly, but he said, I was just doing my job. I had no choice in the matter. There were some things I just had to do. I don't care about your job. Let me ask you something. Did you drag my student into the Ice Blue Knights by force? Against his will? Isha stared at Ice Blue Night King as she spoke. Ice Blue Night King looked glum, and he admitted, yes. Were you the one who captured him? Isha asked. Yes, Ice Blue Night King said. If you were unable to look after him, why would you drag my student all the way out here? Is that how you manage the Ice Blue Knights? Isha hissed. Ice Blue Night King could not speak. His face turned red. Another Ice Blue Knight, who was accompanying Ice Blue Night King, stepped forward to angrily tell her off. Knife, don't be so rude. You are a member of the Ice Blue Knights yourself. How can you speak like that to your captain? From now on, I have no affiliation with the Ice Blue Knights. It's over. Isha looked at them all with disdain. Ice Blue Night King frowned and said, Knife, I understand the reasons for this mood of yours, but there are some things you can't just say. I will pretend I did not hear what you just said. If you want to talk, we can do so later and in private. There is nothing more for us to talk about. Let's go, Han Sr. Isha turned around to leave. Knife, don't be ridiculous. The Ice Blue Knights have rules. You are a member of the Ice Blue Knights, and you were born to be an Ice Blue Knight. Furthermore, you will one day die on behalf of the Ice Blue Knights. The Ice Blue Knights would never permit one of their members to turn traitor, and furthermore, the Extreme King would not allow. Ice Blue Night King trailed off, a shocked look crossing his face. Isha's body had filled with purple air. Like a demon, she covered the entirety of the Ice Blue Night base with her power. Suddenly, everyone in the base looked very pale. The weight of her suppression lay on them so heavily that they could barely stand. Deified. You became deified. Ice Blue Night King, and all the other Ice Blue Knights were stunned. I'm sorry. Do you mind repeating what you were telling me again? Isha turned an unyielding gaze on Ice Blue Night King and the others. The King-class Ice Blue Knights had all turned pale. No one dared look Isha in the eyes now. Ice Blue Knight King had also paled, and a series of emotions crossed his face, too quickly to recognize. He ultimately sighed and said, I have my own reasons to want you to stay, but since you are already deified, I suppose the Ice Blue Knights don't stand a chance in keeping you here. In that case, I give you permission to leave. Isha did not look at Ice Blue Knight King. She took Han Sun with her and departed the Ice Blue Knight base. My queen, that was awesome. Those Ice Blue Knights all looked so cocky, but they were ready to pee themselves before your glory, Han Sun told her as he piloted the white whale away from the base. After Isha and Han Sun departed the Ice Blue Knights, they used the big white whale to travel through space. They were headed back to Narrow Moon. Isha was holding Bauer. She fed Bauer pieces of fruit as she spoke. The 10 sets of Knights of the Extreme King. They all sound so powerful. They inspire fear across the Geno universe, spreading the belief that every knight has the power to destroy a race. But inside the Extreme King, the knights are still just pawns. They do the dirty work and little more. They aren't given important missions. If any of the members of the knights manage to become deified, they are permitted to leave. They are no longer bound to the knights. This is a rule of the Extreme Kings. Ice Blue Knight King could not have fought against that. A powerful regiment of knights like the Ice Blue Knights are still only considered pawns. Han Sun was shocked to hear this. They don't have any deified members. If you think that is the primary army of the Extreme King, you are profoundly underestimating their might. Isha smiled, then went on to say, the primary army of the Extreme King is composed of the Royal Knights. They only recruit pure members of the Extreme King, however. And all entrants have to be at least King class. They have very high requirements when it comes to having the right blood and background. Aside from the Royal Knights, the Extreme King have many other organizations as well. Most of those are simply less famous. The Extreme King are so strong that very few races are able to compete with them. Even higher races like Sky Palace wouldn't stand a chance against the Extreme King in a fight. They rely on the power of the very high to make the Extreme King avoid them. That's the only reason that the Extreme King have never touched Sky Palace. I see. Han Sun did not understand how the Extreme King worked. He thought for a minute, then asked, then what is Narrow Moon to the Extreme King? We do not belong to anyone. Isha sighed and then said, I told you before. Our elder was a servant of Hell King at one point, but Hell King's time has long since passed. Now the ruler of the Extreme King is known as White King. Narrow Moon has never had a deified member before. But becoming deified would change little for rebate politics. A rebate would never be considered pure of race, and so they could never choose a side. They would be puppets. As long as my queen is here, the rebate will become one of the most famous high races in the entire universe. Han Sun was quick to lick her boots. Isha was his biggest supporter. The safety and security of Han Sun and his friends and family all depended on Isha. Isha rolled her eyes. Tell me what happened in Narrow Moon. Han Sun told her about everything that had transpired in Narrow Moon. He did not exaggerate anything, but even so, Isha's face darkened after hearing it all. They divided up all of my possessions? They were cruel to my one and only student? They are all such rotten bullies. Han Sun's heart felt touched. If she was saying things like that, then that meant he really was quite important to her. It is okay that they bullied my student, but they stole my palace and dirted up all my things. I cannot allow this, Isha said angrily. Han Sun was touched before, but now he was speechless. He rubbed his nose and said, yeah, you cannot allow that. You are going to have to teach them all a lesson. As the white whale left the ice blue system, Han Sun guided it towards where Night River King had been stationed. He was unable to find anything out of the ordinary there, however, and he couldn't find a single trace of that weird purple stuff that Night River King had mentioned repeatedly. Han Sun even went to see the Ice Blue Knight, who had taken over Night River King's position. But the knight hadn't seen anything strange during his time stationed there. Weird. What was that purple thing Night River King was talking about? What about the journal entries he made in code? Han Sun didn't understand, But he didn't plan on lingering in the system to figure it out either. Han's son turned the white whale out of the system, plotting a course back to Narrow Moon. He didn't see under Overbearing again, and neither did he see the black hole spider. They did encounter many more of those galactic shrimp. The attacks of the shrimp were unable to penetrate the defenses of the white whale, though. And added to that, none of the creatures were as fast as the white whale. Having a powerful ship like the white whale ensured their safety as they traveled, assuming that they only ran into ordinary xenogeneics like the galactic shrimp. If they got into trouble, it would be because they bumped into a creature like Under Overbearing or the black hole spider. Of course, even if that happened, they had the deified elite Isha on board. They had good luck in their travels. Isha and Han's son were able to depart the systems of chaos with absolute safety. They would soon be back in Narrow Moon. Dude, what happened? Why has every noble across every planet been ordered to go to Full Moon Hall? Haven't you heard? Knife Queen is back. Knife Queen is back. How is that possible? I thought she died in the systems of chaos. That's what all the nobles thought too. That's why they plundered her legacy inventory without fear. But she has really come back, and not just that. She's come back deified. What? Queen has become deified? This is awesome. We rebate finally have a deified elite in our ranks. Who would dare underestimate us now? Queen is way too powerful. Teehee. It might be good for us. But what about the nobles who divided up her things? They stole her legacy and crushed her student Han's son under their feet. Now that she has come back deified, they must be shivering in their boots. They had it coming. They think they're so high and mighty, bullying a student. I'm happy that those nobles are going to get told off. They always bully us, don't they? And we can never fight back. Now that they are in trouble, well, it's what they deserve. As Narrow Moon's people were discussing Knife Queen's return, a serious discussion was being held in Full Moon Hall. No, absolutely not. Miss Knife, Han's son is just an outsider. He does not have what it takes to be our holy child, an elder said, shaking his head forcefully. Flower King said, Knife, Miss, don't you think that this is a little inappropriate? The holy child has always been the best and most promising of the rebate. Han's son isn't even one of our kind. Even if we force him to become our holy child, the rest of our citizens will vehemently object to the selection. Miss Knife, please think about this. Black Moon King liked Han's son, but even he did not think that this was right. They risked angering their entire race. All the nobles were arguing against Isha's decision to elect Han's son as the holy child. Full Moon Hall was filled with so many shouting voices that it was louder than a supermarket. Moonwheel King raised his hand to tell everyone to quiet down. Then he looked at Isha and said, Knife, we were not considerate to you and Han's son in your absence. We can give him whatever he deserves, but the position of holy child is something of gross importance. It affects the very legacy and glory of our race. Allowing an outsider to take this position is in no way appropriate. You must think about this decision some more. Are you guys done? Isha sat at the head of the conference table. She coldly looked upon all of the nobles that had gathered there. All of those nobles felt a massive chill as her eyes came to stare at each of them in turn. They fell utterly silent under the weight of her gaze. The same was true for Flower King, as it was all the others. After everyone stopped talking, Isha spoke in a slow, deliberate voice. What if I insist that Han's son becomes our holy child? Knife Queen, if you insist, then you'll have to forgive us for being unreasonable. The elders will never agree to this notion, and I am sure none of the kings here in Full Moon Hall agree to it either. The members of the Council of Elders kept trying to convince her. Knife Queen, we are objecting to your plan in order to preserve the legacy and glory of the rebate. We cannot allow everything we have built for the rebate to be destroyed. Are you saying I am destroying the rebate as a whole? Isha asked coldly. Knife Queen, that is not what we meant. The elder wanted to say more, but Isha cut him off. Isha swept her gaze across the nobles and stopped at Moonwheel King. I called you all here to tell you of the decision I have made. I did not call you here for you to voice your opinions on the matter. Starting from today, Han's son is the holy child of the rebate. If you have a problem with the decision, let me hear it now. Many of the nobles were frozen. Although they objected, no one wished to square off against Isha. They all looked at Moonwheel King. Moonwheel King frowned and looked at Isha. What if we all object at once? Isha laughed. She stood up, ignoring Moonwheel King. She looked down upon all of the nobles and slowly said, "Listen up, people. From now on, Narrow Moon is my narrow moon. The rebate have only one queen. Whoever follows me will live, but anyone who seeks to betray me will die. You can object, but if you directly disobey one of my commands, I will consider you an enemy. I do not mind an injection of fresh blood to fill up the ranks of Narrow Moon." Over the next few months, political instability swept through the rebate. The people in power kept changing, and families rose and fell on a daily basis. Hansen really admired Isha's decisiveness. Once she made her mind up, she took sole control of rebate society, without looking back. She'd lacked the strength to make such a bold power grab before, but now that she was deified, she could suppress anyone who rose against her. She ruled single-handedly, which allowed complicated issues to get resolved much faster. But other problems began to appear. There were many different factions within rebate society, and no one could say for certain if Isha would be able to unite the fragmented society while maintaining her dictatorship. Some issues could not be solved through power alone. Claiming the throne had been Isha's first step, but there was a long road ahead of her. Han Sun was confident in Isha, but he honestly didn't pay much attention to the political turmoil of the rebate. He was busy investigating the information given to him by Mr. White. The techniques of the Xianmen were very deep. There was a great deal of information to sift through, which included more than just a few genoarts. Some of what Han Sun read would take a few hundred years to truly comprehend. There were many things that couldn't be truly understood by merely reading a book. Instead, they had to be figured out by each individual. The teachings of the Xianmen were this sort of knowledge. Han Sun planned to find a few people that could research the Xianmen information on his behalf and determine what content might be suitable for humans to learn. He also wanted to establish a special school in the Alliance that would teach the Xianmen techniques to other humans. He wanted to pass on the knowledge and expand the lineage of the Xianmen. It was just as Mr. White had said. If 1 or 2 people in every 10 million were able to follow the righteous path of Xianmen, then that would be enough. Surprisingly, Ji Yanran expressed an interest in the subject. Han Sun quickly turned the project over to her. But Ji Yanran didn't do as Han Sun hoped. Instead of building a school for the purpose of teaching the Xianmen philosophy, she opened up a martial hall. In it, she would start by teaching the Xianmen martial arts, whereas the philosophies of the Xianmen way would be taught at a later time. No one will treasure something that is earned very easily, and the Xianmen way of thinking is not suitable for everyone. It requires too much heart. By teaching them this way, the philosophies are likely to be accepted by more people, Ji Yanran explained. Ji Yanran's line of thinking made sense to Han Senator. He had only learned the secret techniques of the Xianmen, anyway. He didn't actually understand the core concepts of the Xianmen way himself. Potential students would have absolutely no experience with the Xianmen techniques going in, so it would likely be a waste of time for them to learn. Not many people would ever be able to understand this stuff. If we can't even start a school, do you really think your martial hall will work? Han Sun asked, purely to be contrary. Ji Yanran laughed. This will be easy. We only need your big face for an advertisement, and our doors will be swarmed with upper-class socialites begging to sign up. They only need to hear that these techniques were practiced by the great Han Senator. I wager they'd fight to the death and use any trick in the book to get their kids accepted into our martial hall. Mr. White's intention was to see the Xianmen expanded. If you approach things like this, you are only serving the needs of the upper class. Han Sun frowned. Ji Yanran laughed and said, Don't worry. Over the years, most ideas start with high society. Once an idea has been accepted by the wealthy and powerful, it is more easily disseminated to the lower class. This is especially true when it comes to the ideals of the Xianmen. In ancient times, famous philosophers and scholars would embark on lengthy journeys to convince people of all different societal levels of their ideals. Now we just need time and advertisements. Honey, don't work yourself to the bone. You should bring on some added help. Han's son could not be bothered to help her himself, of course. If she was willing to shoulder the responsibility, then that was fine with him. The box Han's son had taken from Holy Town was locked, so he couldn't open it. He had tried to pry it open in many different ways, but nothing worked. Even Isha's power had been insufficient to break the jade stone box. Because Han's son hadn't been able to find out what was inside, he put the box away for the moment. Instead, he turned his attention to the bone needle. It was the one Han's son took from the palace maze. There were 12 drops of deified blood still inside it. They represented 12 different deified blood pulses. Han's son did not use them. First, he wanted to research them. Because Han's son's body still contained more ghost bone power than he could use, he currently had no need for the energy that the deified blood pulses offered. He pondered the blood pulses for a while, and he eventually decided to have a drop anyway. Han's son chose to consume the drop he had retrieved from the blood demon. It was of the blood element. He wanted to see if it might help his blood pulse sutra. Han's son lifted the bone needle above his chest, and then he thrust it into his heart. This was not an intravenous injection like one would receive from an ordinary doctor. If a normal person tried this as Han's son did, they would most definitely die. Do not try this at home. The bone needle pierced right through his heart, and a drop of deified blood spilled into him. Han's son was about to begin refining the deified blood when he suddenly heard an announcement play in his head. Successful infusion of deified gene. Deified gene +1. Deified progress is 1 out of 100. After that announcement, Han's son felt a scary power explode in his heart and sweep into every corner of his body. His cells shuddered as the new power surged through him, and he began to change. His body felt like he was shedding, sloughing off layer upon layer of old cells. This entire process lasted a whole day before coming to an end. Trails of a black substance littered the floor, like the flaky remains of a dead snake. It looked quite scary. Han's son. Super God Spirit Body Gene Battle Body. Mutant Blood Duke. Spell Marquise. Dongxian Marquise. Jade Skin Duke. Level. Duke Genes. 17 Deified Progress. 1/100 Lifespan. 1100. Han's son was shocked. He did not know what deified progress meant. Are deified genes different from the genes that come before? What does deified progress mean? Does this mean I will be deified once the number reaches 100? I can achieve deified status without maxing out any other genes? Han's son could not figure out what was going on. Han's son studied himself after receiving his one deified gene. His body had changed. It was like his genes had all improved. What hadn't improved, though, was his fitness. It was still at the level of a duke. Han's son tried to refine another deified drop of blood. The process was exactly the same. Han's son's body changed again, and he received an additional deified gene point. His deified progress became 2 of 100. His fitness did not increase much, but if he was able to earn deified genes, that meant it was a power that humans could accept. That relaxed many of Han's son's worries, and he absorbed the rest of the deified blood. Over the next 2 weeks, Han's son refined his deified blood. His deified progress became 12 of 100, and after the refining process, his fitness increased by quite a bit. But strangely, Han's son didn't gain any special blood pulse powers after receiving the deified blood pulses. Where can I get more deified genes? Once I reach 100, I guess I'll be able to find out what it does, Han's son thought to himself. It would be too difficult to kill deified beings by himself, though. At his current strength, it was an impossible task. It's a shame that the little red bird ate my son Raven. If it hadn't, I could have given it a try. Perhaps I could eat the flesh of deified creatures, Han's son thought to himself. Thinking about the little red bird, Han's son checked on the egg inside the bird's nest again. Han's son was shocked. A number of weird substance chains had appeared from the nest and were drilling into the red egg. The red color of the egg was shining brightly, as if it was being consumed by a red fire. $23.99 The Raging Insect dollar will die. Dragon 1 could see that Han's son was about to be swallowed by the weird insect. Instead of being sad for Han's son, He was sad about what Han Sen's death would mean for all of them. Even Han Sen, who could somehow nullify the air restriction, couldn't escape this monster. If Han Sen couldn't escape, then it likely meant death for them all. Dragon 8, who was following Dragon 1, also saw what was about to happen. He looked just as glum. Boom! In the sky, the insect's enormous mouth was closing around Han Senator. Its sharp teeth were about to clamp down on Han Sen's body. Dragon 1 and the others couldn't bring themselves to look at the horrible sight. They turned their heads and continued running as hard as they could. They hoped they could find a place on Planet Dark Zone that wasn't smothered by the air restriction area. That was the only way they might be able to escape this hellhole. Han Sen's body didn't break because of the weird insect's attack though. He was still in super god spirit mode, so the creature's incredible power was unable to touch him. While the weird insect's teeth pierced through his body, they didn't actually bring him any harm. Han Sen's body was incorporeal now, rather like a ghost's. He moved effortlessly through the weird insect's teeth and flesh, and he was on the verge of escaping the creature's body when he realized that he didn't want to leave just yet. He turned around, heading deeper into the maw of the weird insect. The hard bug shell and flesh couldn't restrict Han Sen's movement. He moved quickly through the insect's entire body. But Han Sen found that the inside of the creature was like jade. Even its organs and vessels had taken the texture of xenogenic genes. There was no weakness to be found anywhere, so it would be hard for Han Sen to hurt the creature from the inside. But Han Sen had found the beast's xenogenic core located in its brain. It was a green core that shone like the stars. Time passed. Han Sen's super god spirit mode could last much longer now that he had reached king class. He couldn't use it forever, but he could certainly last around half an hour. Staying close to the green deified core of the beast, Han Sen gathered up power in his hand to perform super spank. Once he built up sufficient power, he moved toward the green core. BZD. The substance chains went crazy under the impact of Han Sen's hand. They were like rubber bands that couldn't be broken. Roar. The weird insect felt a sharp pain in its head, and so it roared. Its body hit the ground, then drilled deep inside. It decided to go for Dragon 1. The insect snapped up a destroyed king, plunging through the man's king area like it wasn't even there. Blood splattered everywhere. It was like it had eaten a sheep, not a scary king. Dragon 1 headed for the other side of the planet. He tried using every power at his disposal to fight back, but against that deified insect, all of his powers seemed to be useless. The scariest thing about the creature was its king area. If they met an ordinary deified xenogenic, Dragon 1, and the others could still make an easy escape. But this weird insect's area power not only restricted air travel, it stopped any powers being used in the atmosphere. Even using skills or items to teleport was impossible. They were trapped. Run! Run for your life! Dragon 1 and the others used all their various powers to try to escape, but the creature picked them off one by one. In the end, only Dragon 1, Dragon 8, Bar, and Dia Robber were left alive. They were injured, but they were still running. Somehow they all started to work together. They knew that if they didn't, they had no chance of surviving. The bodies of Dragon 8 and Bar were special. They were almost immortal. That incredible power allowed them to escape some attacks and continue breathing. Dragon 1 and Dia Robber were top-tier kings. They were invincible when it came to fighting others of the king class, but attempting to deal with this scary deified was enough to leave them injured and bleeding. Boom! The weird insect clamped its jaw around Bar's leg, and Dia Robber took that moment to gather up 3 different types of power. He created a triangle composed of 3 different energies. Light blossomed inside that triangle, breaking space and shaking the air around it. The light shot forward, smacking right into the weird insect's mouth. But the weird insect just swallowed the light, which disappeared harmlessly down its throat. Dia Robber looked pale and hopeless. That was the strongest move he could conjure, but it hadn't affected the weird insect in the least. That insect wasn't an ordinary deified monster. Its area power and the strength of its body both indicated that whatever it was, this creature was far better than an average deified xenogenic. Although they hadn't exhausted all of their strength yet, Dragon 1 and the others knew that if they could not escape the weird insect's area, then they were sure to die. This is bad. Why did we randomly encounter a xenogeniac with such a scary area? Dragon 8 groused loudly as he ran. Dragon 1 remained silent though. He knew that complaining would help no one. He needed to last as long as he could, grasping every additional second that he could, in the hope that a miracle might save them. Maybe a new idea would occur to one of them, something that could help. Dia Robber was of a similar mindset. In that place, no one could save them. Even if the deified elites of his race knew they were in danger, deifieds were not permitted access to the universal core area. Only king-class beings were allowed to enter this place. You could not be one level higher, nor one level lower. If I am to die, I do not want to die fleeing, Bar snarled with a furious look on his face. He turned around and sprinted towards the weird insect. His body blazed with a sword light. Dia Robber started to stop him, but then he realized that with the situation they were currently in, no matter how hard they ran, they could not run far enough. Stopping Bar was pointless. Bar slashed the weird insect's head, but the bone knife never made contact with the weird insect's shell. The substance chains on its body caught the knife and crushed it. Bar's hand touched the substance chains. His arm vanished in a cloud of fleshy scraps. The weird insect opened its mouth to chase down the injured Bar. Bar couldn't run any further though, and he didn't want to. He summoned his area power, and used his left hand to punch the weird insect's face. Bar's powerful area was as weak as an eggshell before the brute force of the weird insect's teeth. Bar's king area shattered, and his body was bitten in half. The bitten section of his body disappeared down the creature's gullet. Although Bar could respawn and gain strength each time, the process required his cells to be close by. Now that half of his body was swallowed and digested, he could no longer respawn. The weird insect swung around, going for what was left of Bar's body. Bar was still conscious, but the situation was hopeless. Roar! As the weird bug came down to eat the other half of his body, Bar realized he was going to die. But then the bug suddenly squealed. Its body became straight and rigid, like it had been electrified. Bar and the others froze in place. They weren't sure what was happening. Blurg! The weird insect opened its mouth, then spewed out dark green blood like a fountain. The blood sprayed all over Bar. Chapter 2400 Stone Destiny's Tower blood continued to fountain out of the insect's mouth, spilling all over the place. It looked as if something was fighting its way out. Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 asked together, squinting at the figure that emerged. They could barely believe their eyes. They wanted to scream, but their question came out as a whisper. He had been eaten by a deified creature, and yet he hadn't been killed. It was a miracle. Hansen finished pulling himself free and climbed to his feet. He didn't have any blood on him. He didn't even look injured. Dragon 1 stared at him in disbelief. The weird insect shrieked and thrashed a little. It looked to be in a great deal of pain. Instead of pursuing Hansen, it just drilled back into the earth and disappeared. The green area power that had covered the sky suddenly disappeared. Dragon 8 stared at the hole it left behind in bewilderment. What did you do? Dragon 8 asked slowly, his voice a little shaken. Nothing. I just thought I'd hurt it a little. Hansen paused for a moment then said, let's go. Once it heals, I doubt we'll be able to escape again. Putting action to words, Hansen left the ground and headed out of Planet Dark Zone's atmosphere. He had wanted to kill the weird insect, but the creature was way too strong. It had taken all of Hansen's strength to keep using super spank on the weird insect's core. Despite exhausting all of his energy and approaching the time limit of his super god spirit body, he was only able to leave a single crack across the core. He hadn't been able to actually break it. Luckily, although the weird insect was strong, it wasn't smart. The crack in the creature's core was small and not terribly threatening, but the bug had chosen to run away even so. If it had continued going after Hansen, his super god spirit would have given out eventually. He could have died. Dragon 1, Dragon 8, Dia Robber, and the newly reassembled Bar didn't hesitate. They followed Hansen away from Planet Dark Zone. The 5 of them didn't speak, and they flew as fast as they could until they were well beyond Planet Dark Zone. The weird insect didn't follow, which all of them were incredibly grateful for. It looks like we're all injured, and I need to go take a rest. Let's split up here, Han-sun said, preparing to use his self-universe cogwheel to leave the universal core area. He had an idea about how to deal with the weird insect, but he was too weak to do anything about it now. He would have to wait until he was stronger. Dragon One said, "Dollar, if you still want to work together, we should set up a time and place to meet. It will be hard to fit you into my schedule, but we can discuss this when I find the time." Han-sun didn't want to set up a meeting time, because he was currently in the Extreme King. He wouldn't always be able to come here on a schedule. Should we have a way of contacting each other? Dragonate said. In the Geno universe, the stronger ones always earned respect. Everyone wanted friends who were stronger than them, especially friends like Han Senator. He was a first-tier king capable of fighting against a deified xenogeniac. Plus, he had proven his ability to hurt many scary people. It almost seemed like he was deified already. If someone could make friends with him, they would. After all, it would be better to have him as an ally than an enemy. Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 wanted to maintain a good relationship with him. Even if they couldn't be friends, they wanted Han-sun to think positively about them. Finding yourself at odds with someone like him was never a good plan. So you are Dollar. You are even stronger than the stories say. When would you like to fight me? Bar asked. Looking at Han, Senator Diarobber laughed and said, Bar, stop messing around. Today, Dollar was the sole reason that we survived. If you don't mind, Dollar, please leave us a contact number. We would like to pay the debt we now owe you. It's okay. I was just trying to save myself. You don't need to contact me again. We'll meet again whenever luck decides, Han-sun said, then used his self-universe cogwheel. After a while, a giant metal cogwheel door appeared, and Han-sun walked through it and left. Now that his self-universe cogwheel had been activated, it would continue running on its own. Using it didn't require any additional energy. Opening the door to the Universal Core Hall did have some requirements, though. Once Han-sun began the process of summoning the door, using his self-universe cogwheel, he couldn't move it. If he moved away from the door, he would destroy the connection. At that point, he'd have to start the process all over. In addition, summoning the door took a while. It would be impossible to summon during combat, so the door couldn't be used as an escape route if Han-sun got into trouble. Plus, when he returned to the core area, he would end up exactly where he had left the previous time. He wouldn't just randomly teleport to some other location in the core area. Brother Dragon 1, who is this Dollar? Can you tell me? Diarobber looked at Dragon 1. Dragon 1 shook his head. We met him by chance, and we worked together twice. We don't know much about him. No more than you guys do. I have never heard of a race called human before. How could they have produced an elite like that? It is confusing. Diarobber asked, his expression mystified. I am afraid that because of Dollar, humans might become famous across the universe. We don't know if there are any other strong humans. If he's the only one with such strength, like Kong Fei was, he would still be alone. He cannot change the world in that case, Dragon 1 answered. The four of them lost themselves in deep thought. None of them said anything. And eventually, they all used their self-universe cogwheels to leave the Universal Core Hall. After Diarobber returned to the destroyed, he went looking for other destroyed kings. He asked the ones he could find to stay in the vicinity of Planet Dark Zone. They were to wait inside the core area. And if Dollar reappeared, they would contact Diarobber at once. Coincidentally, when Dragon 1 returned to the dragon, he did exactly the same thing. Clearly, they were waiting for Han-sun to return to the core area too. Han-sun came out of the Universal Core Hall back in Underwater Town. Bauer was lying on his bed, and she rubbed her eyes when she heard movement. Seeing that it was Han-sun, she leaped into his arms. Dad? Where were you? Why didn't you take me? Bauer lifted her lips. I reached King Class a few days ago. I got pulled into the core area. Han-sun looked at Bauer and asked, Can you and the little bird enter the core area? Core area? What is that? Bauer asked in confusion. If Bauer did not know, then she probably couldn't join him. And the little red bird was deified, so it couldn't go in with him either. Otherwise, Han Sun could use the little red bird to kill the weird insect. Han Sun had used his super god spirit mode for too long, and his body was exhausted. He felt very powerless and sore. Han Sun didn't plan on returning to the core area anytime soon. He rested for a few days and ate some of the core xenogenic genes each day. His number of king genes kept increasing. His body had almost recovered when the day came for him to enter Destiny's Tower. He didn't want to be late, and so he arrived at the site an hour early. The Extreme King were quite effective. They had 4 elites on standby to open the door of Destiny's Tower for Han Sun and let him in. Han Sun had long been curious about Destiny's Tower, and that was because this stone Destiny's Tower was just like the metal Destiny's Tower inside his Sea of Soul. Aside from the towers being made of different materials, one having been made of stone and other having been made of metal, there was no difference. 4 deified elites used their powers to force open the gate to Destiny's Tower. Only one person could go in while the gate was being held up. Once he received the signal, Han Sun immediately ran into the tower. Dang! Han Sun had just entered the tower when the door slammed shut behind him. Because Han Sun knew the process though, he wasn't afraid. The 4 deified elites had to use formation powers just to get the door open. And it could only be kept open for a single second. It simply wasn't feasible to keep it open any longer than that. Han Sun was given 1 month to spend in Destiny's Tower. When that month was up, the door would open again, and Han Sun would be allowed to leave. Han Sun looked around the tower. He had heard there was supposed to be an amazing Geno art located inside the tower, and any creature that learned it would be able to increase the speed of their evolution. But everyone who left the tower seemed to practice different Geno arts. That made Han Sun curious about whether the rumor was true. Han Sun was on the first floor of Destiny's Tower. The layout was exactly like his own Destiny's Tower, but there were some paintings hanging on the walls of this tower. The pictures were supposedly the Geno arts of legend, but when Han Sun looked closer, he realized that the pictures were not Geno arts at all. They were drawings of people. The pictures were of a man. Han Sun couldn't tell if he was human, crystallizer, extreme king, or one of the sky. They all looked so similar that it was hard to tell the precise race of the man in the painting. But this man wasn't drawn like an average person. He was drawn like a god atop an altar. Every wall held a picture depicting the same man in a different position. But no matter how he was posed, he seemed to be looking out of the picture with disdain. It was somehow uncomfortable to meet the painted man's gaze. Although Han Sun knew it was just a drawing, not a living man, the painted man gave him a chilled feeling. It was like the eyes of the man could see right through his soul or something. Han Sun frowned. The longer he looked at the painting, the more he wanted to avoid it. That wasn't normal. Is there something wrong with this drawing? Or is it like a jade spirit in the white jade jing? Is it actually alive? Han Sun looked at the man in the painting, but try as he might, he couldn't discern its true nature. He looked across the whole first floor, but he found nothing except for pictures of that one man. Han Sun silently moved on to the second floor. Upon reaching the second floor, Han Sun frowned. This floor had paintings of the man on every wall as well. He was just posed in different positions than he had been on the first floor. This entire tower isn't just full of this one man's paintings, is it? Han Sun's heart jumped, and so he proceeded to the third floor. Of course, Han Sun was unlucky. His guess had been correct. The third floor held the same paintings. Each floor in the tower had 8 walls. Each wall had a painting of its own. Han Sun walked all the way from the first floor to the 6th floor, and he saw 48 of the man's paintings in total. It was the same person in every painting. He was just in a different position in each one. He would be sitting in one, while in another, he could be standing or lying down. All the pictures had the man in a different position. But no matter what his position was, the man's eyes were always the same. Han Sun hated those eyes. The man wasn't ugly. In fact, Han Sun thought he was quite handsome. The man had a smile that should have been lovable, but instead Han Sun loathed it. He couldn't put his finger on why. Han Sun was a little surprised by that realization, because he didn't like judging people by their appearance. It didn't matter if a person looked nice or horrible. He would not form a real opinion on them until he learned more about who they really were. But now, looking at these paintings, Han-sun already hated this man. That was not normal at all. Trying to suppress his hatred, Han-sun climbed to the highest floor. This was the 7th floor. If the Stone Destiny's Tower was related to his Metal Destiny's Tower, the 7th floor should have a space by Sima. That was where Han-sun imprisoned people in his own tower. As soon as Han-sun stepped onto the 7th floor of Destiny's Tower, he stopped dead in his tracks. There were no more of those paintings on the 7th floor. There was just a stone platform in the middle of the room. Someone was sitting atop the stone platform, and Han-sun realized instantly that it was the same man showcased in the 48 paintings across the lower floors. He sat atop the stone platform, his legs crossed like a Buddha. His hands were down, and his eyes were shut. It was like he was sleeping. Han-sun couldn't detect a life force coming from the man, though. The man was like a statue. With Han-sun's eyesight, though, he could tell the man actually was alive. He could see the man's pores and the pink of his skin. Han-sun could see most of his vessels, too. Aside from the fact that he wasn't breathing, he really did look like someone who was alive. Han-sun used the Dongxian aura to inspect the man. It was odd that the man looked so alive while giving off utterly no indication of life force. Even after scanning the man, Han-sun couldn't tell if he was living or dead. That was extremely weird. While Han-sun was examining the man, some sort of odd wave began to pass through the air around the man's body. The air moved in a circle, like a nearly invisible whirlpool. Han-sun took a step back. He soon realized that the swirl was just a life force, not anything harmful. What astonished Han-sun the most, though, was that the black crystal armor in his Sea of Soul reacted to the whirlpool. The armor began to tremble. A mysterious power flowed out of the armor and sank into Han-sun's body. Han-sun felt himself become really heavy. It was like the cells inside his body had been frozen in place by that mysterious power. The Dongxian Sutra and Han-sun's other primary Geno arts had been locked down by the strange power as well. Only the original Water King body and a few other powers Han-sun had absorbed were still active inside his body. What is this? Han-sun asked in sudden trepidation. Then the man slowly opened his eyes. It looked like he was smiling at Han-sun, but he wasn't. Han-sun's heart flared with that feeling of hatred again, but this time, it was 1,000 times stronger than it had been when he saw those pictures. Han-sun managed to suppress the feelings and keep them from showing on his face. Han-sun finally figured out where the feelings were coming from, though. The passionate hatred inside him was flowing out of the black crystal armor. It wasn't his own emotion. The man stared at Han-sun the same way he'd gazed out of the paintings. He smiled and coldly asked, "Do you believe that this world has a god?" Chapter 2402 God's Wish. Han-sun's heart jumped. He didn't mind hearing about deifieds, but he really did mind hearing the word God. This sensitivity came from his time in the sanctuaries. Since he first entered the sanctuaries, he had come to despise the word God. Even hearing it would put him in a bad mood for a long time, especially when it came to the events with the 7th team. They had really affected Han Sr. This guy cannot be the god that claims to grant wishes, can he? Han-sun stared at the man who sat atop the stone platform, and he really thought that this man had to be the one he had heard so much about. Plus, the black crystal armor's reaction made Han-sun much more alarmed. I've never heard of any of the Extreme King dying in this Destiny's Tower. People claim to learn a lot from their time in the tower. No matter what is said about this place, there is never a hint of something fatal residing inside. Otherwise, with so many people having already entered this place, at least one of them should have died, Han-sun thought to himself. No wonder each of the Extreme King learned something different inside the tower, though. There is no Geno art here. There is just this living god. Han-sun froze, and he didn't answer. The man asked again, "Young man, do you believe that God exists in this world?" "Yes," Han-sun answered with certainty. But inside he thought, "Of course I believe. Han's big brother is Dollar God." The man nodded, and he went on to say, "If I told you I was God, would you believe me?" "I would," Han-sun said, feigning cooperation. He wanted that man to keep talking. After all the time Han Sen had spent tracking down bits and pieces of this man's exploits, he badly wanted to know what the man's true goal was, or where he might have come from. The man didn't seem impressed or concerned by Han Sen's answer though. His expression hadn't changed, and he still smiled. It is a fated meeting that you have come here to speak with me. I can fulfill one wish for you. You can say whatever you want, as it should be something deep in your heart. You only have one chance. No matter what you say, it will be fulfilled. But you cannot change what you wish for. This guy is just like King Kun. Han Sen chuckled darkly in his heart. He looked at the man. I can make any wish? Han Sen asked, looking at the man. Any wish that you desire. God can do anything, the man said calmly. Han Sen frowned, and he didn't speak. Making a wish seemed like a simple process, but there were many traps. Each member of the 7th team from the Alliance had made a wish, but before the end, each one of them had regretted their wish. Something disastrous that they never expected had befallen them. For instance, Han Sen could wish for a lot of money. God would set up an accident and drop a lot of money right into his lap. Things would seem great, until it eventually came out that the money had belonged to a psychotic killer. While Han Sen would indeed be the recipient of great fortune for a time, he would eventually be killed by that psychotic killer. God was supposed to be an abstract concept. Once people made their wishes to God, they were supposed to move on with their lives, not linger in the moment. If people really thought that God was a person who granted wishes like this man, it would be very dangerous. If someone believed in God, then they believed that God was a real force in the world. Every action he took would have ramifications in the world. He wouldn't just be able to make something out of nothing. So whatever wish a person made should be something that already existed inside the universe someplace. These items would, of course, have a pre-established connection to the universe. Any rare item that someone wished for would be deeply associated with the workings of the world. Han Sen used to think that if God really existed and he could really fulfill wishes, then he might be a special sort of life form that had causal powers. A person had to wish for something they wanted, but the consequences of the item might befall the wisher. So the rarer the item was, the greater the consequences could be. The price that had to be paid could be huge. If a person wished for $10,000, and that $10,000 were with a mother who wanted to heal her ailing son, and that $10,000 were then given to the wisher, the son would die from lack of treatment. That death, and that mother's hatred would end up on the wisher. If the wisher was greedy and wished for $1 million, the wish might hurt 100 lives. The wisher would be hated by 100 families. Having 100 different families seeking revenge against you would be a high price to pay. Those were just Han Sen's predictions and guesses though. They might not have actually been true. But according to what happened to the 7th team, the guesses were in the realm of possibilities. It didn't matter if someone wished for immortality or a return to their youth. Every wish had its price. That price also took away the governance of a person's own life and death. Perhaps it was because there were too many consequences. But sometimes, not even death brought freedom from the consequences of a wish. They would have to continue their miserable existence to pay back the debt. If this theory is correct, then everyone who entered this Destiny's Tower should have paid a price. But I haven't heard of any misfortunes among the people who have come here. Why? Han Sen frowned. The guy that was claiming to be God noticed Han Sen's continued silence. He smiled and said, "You can think about what you wish to want to make. There are 48 God pictures. They all have my will in them. You can go and take a look. Perhaps they will help you decide. That will be the first gift I give you. When you have thought of the wish you seek to make, come to me and I will make it come true." Han Sen didn't leave. He looked at the man and asked, "If I make a wish, do I have to pay something back in maid?" The man continued smiling and said, "You will." Han Sen was surprised that the man answered. He had thought the self-proclaimed God wouldn't admit this, even if asked. Han Sen immediately followed up his question. "What do I need to give you?" The man looked at Han Sen and didn't answer the question. "You are not the first person to ask me this question, and you surely won't be the last. I can answer you, but if I answer, you must make a wish. Do you agree?" Han Sen thought for a brief moment, and then said seriously, I agree. The man smiled and said, the wish you make will be fulfilled, and that is because it is what you deserve. It is what I deserve. If I want 100 wives, that means the wives will already have been my wives? What sense does that make? Han-sun was frozen. What the man said was something Han-sun couldn't accept, but when he thought about it some more, his breath caught. He now knew why the man would say this. What the man had said was reversed. If you tried to understand it in reverse, then the sentence made sense. But the causal relationship reversed it. Chapter 2403 Vampire. Just as Han-sun predicted, if God was a creature that had causal powers, then he could reverse causal relationships. For example, take a person who wished for $1 million. Normally, the person would have to work for 10 years to earn that much money, but God's powers reversed the causal relationship. God could give that $1 million to the person immediately, and then the person would have to work to pay it back. If someone wished for far more than they could ever pay back, then the wisher would destroy the causal relationship, which would create a serious imbalance within that causal power. It was difficult to imagine what might happen. If this line of thought is true, making a wish is like prepaying wages. If my wish is something I can pay back, then I might not get hurt. Or at least, I might not get hurt very much. Just like Han Jinji, he made a wish, but the wish he made didn't backfire on him, Han-sun thought. The man smiled. You are smart. You understand the meaning behind wishes. I believe you will be able to make the correct wish. Han-sun thought to himself. Many of the extreme king have entered Destiny's Tower, and their lives don't seem to be falling apart afterwards. They must have deciphered the meaning behind the man's words. But is it really true that no one was greedy enough to make a wish they were unable to make good on? Han-sun didn't know if this guy was the same self-proclaimed god that the 7th team had encountered. Whether he was or not, though, Han-sun believed there to be something amiss with this offer. He just hadn't figured out what was wrong yet. When Han-sun didn't speak, the man went on to say, Young man, make a wish you are able to handle. It will be good for you, and it will not harm you. The way he said this made Han-sun frown. There was something familiar about this whole interaction actually. Hang on, I forgot to consider God's perspective in this wishing process. God wouldn't just randomly help people. Why is this guy willing to help others by fulfilling their wishes? Maybe the wishing process isn't like a prepaid wage, but more like an interest-charging loan? This guy might be some sort of celestial loan shark. The thought gave Han-sun a sudden chill. Without a doubt, this god must be benefiting somehow from the wishes that were made. No way he would just sit here and grant wishes out of kindness. There had to be something this god needed that the wishes were providing. Most likely, that benefit would come from the interest rate he charged for each wish. The bigger the wish that was made, the more interest the wisher would owe, and that meant God would benefit even more. As he considered the idea, Han-sun became increasingly convinced that he was right. Han-sun might not have figured out the process perfectly, but he was confident he had gotten the core of the relationship correct. God wasn't some benevolent fulfiller of dreams. He was more like a vampire. But God wouldn't be interested in money, obviously. Han-sun hadn't quite figured out what form this god would want his interest in when he collected it. Han-sun's face turned sour as he thought about all this. If his guesses were even remotely accurate, then regardless of what he wished for, he was still going to lose something. After all, loan sharks kept the interest going even after payment. I still don't know what wish to make. Let me go and have a look at those godly pictures before I make one, Han-sun said, as he looked at the man. You really should think about it, yes. You only get one chance. The man smiled encouragingly. Han-sun left the 7th floor of Destiny's Tower. As he walked, he kept on thinking. From what I have been able to see thus far, God's power must have many restrictions. He cannot directly harm the wishmaker, and he cannot harm creatures of this universe. And it seems as if he cannot use lies and tricks. Otherwise, why would he have told me all that he did? The rules do not permit the use of force or falsehoods. This whole thing sounds very legal and lawyer-like. Although they can't change the rules, They're perfectly happy to use word games and manipulation to get what they want. That is how they trick people, Han Sen thought to himself. Ultimately, he thought it was a good thing that he had come here. He had agreed to make a wish in order to figure out what the wishing process and this god's powers were actually like. Now he had a much better idea of what was happening. His theories couldn't be 100% accurate, but he was better off now than his previous state of complete cluelessness. To defeat an enemy, you had to understand them. Ignorance was the most frightening thing on a battlefield. Now that Han Sen had agreed to make a wish, he might end up paying a price. But he still thought that this was all worth it. At least he would be able to understand God more. What Han Sen needed to do now was avoid getting tangled in the interest he would owe God upon making a wish. According to the theory he was crafting, the smaller the wish Han Sen made, the smaller the price he would have to pay. That would mean there would be less interest. But Han Sen had no idea what scale he should use to measure wishes. How would he know if the wish he made was big or small? For instance, Han Sen might want $1. That was a small amount. And according to the theory, the wish should accrue very little interest, because $1 would be easy to pay back. But God wasn't playing with money here. He was playing with causal powers. If Han Sen wanted that $1, and that $1 came from a scary elite's son, that scary elite's son might die. And the responsibility for that would land firmly upon Han Senator at that point. Han Sen would have to face the scary elite's payback. When wishes were fulfilled by causal power, even seemingly small wishes could turn out to be very dangerous. And whatever the price turned out to be, Han Sen would have to pay it. And the final decision would be in hands of that untrustworthy god. Han Sen would have a difficult time trying to navigate around those rules. It is hard fighting God. The seventh team had so many good people, and yet they all ended up the way they did. It looks as if Gu Qingcheng, who didn't make a wish, made the best decision by far, Han Sen thought to himself. I wonder what wish Han Jinji made. How did he avoid the trap set up by God? Han Sen didn't understand. Or at least he didn't for the moment. But he needed a way to mitigate his risk and make a wish that would cost him the least. There was another thing that Han Sen found extra suspicious. It was the fact that so many of the Extreme King entered the tower, and yet they all ended up okay. Perhaps this god really was a nice loan shark, who only ripped people off a little. Han Sen didn't think that was possible though. All vampires drank blood after all. What is keeping these Extreme King from having their lives destroyed by these wishes? Han Sen kept walking as he thought, staring at the paintings on the walls along the way. Chapter 2404 Han Sen makes his wish. Han Sen thought of many different things he could wish for. He thought of wishing for God to be dead, or for Han Sen himself to become God. Both of those seemed like wishes that God would be unable to fulfill, and thus would be forced to renege on his bargain. But when Han Sen thought about it some more, he realized that those wishes wouldn't work. If Han Sen wished for God to die, he needed a way to make sure that God really was dead. Ordinarily, death meant losing all signs of life. But different types of life also had different types of life signs. When Han Sen first entered the 7th floor and saw the man, he thought the man was dead. If that was the death Han Sen was referring to, then God would fulfill his wish without difficulty. He could make himself lose all signs of life without being negatively impacted. If Han Sen was going to make that sort of wish, he should wish that God had never existed. If God never existed, then he wouldn't be around to fulfill Han Sen's wishes. If he fulfilled Han Sen's wishes, then he wouldn't be around to call in the debt. If he was still around to exact payment, then he could not have fulfilled the wish. It was a simple theory, and the wish should have been impossible to fulfill. The wish made certain assumptions though. If Han Sen really wished for God to never exist, then the assumption would be that the man really was God. If the man told Han Sen he was not God, it would be as if he was erasing God's existence. And then he could make Han Sen pay the price. There were many other similar methods that God could use to avoid getting the bad end of a bargain. God was very good when it came to toying with rules. Because of that, Han Sen didn't think that any of these ideas would work. Han Sen's gaze came down on the paintings of God hanging on the walls, And suddenly, Han Sen saw them very differently than he had before. The position of the paintings hadn't changed, but looking at them now gave Han Sen a very different sensation. Han Sen felt a water mind coming from one picture. The water mind was like a sea. It washed back and forth over Han Sen, making him feel as if he was drowning in the image. His sensitivity to water powers increased. Han Sen was shocked. He looked at all of the pictures one by one, and he found that each of them had a different meaning. Some of them were very soft and gentle, whereas others were very hard and destructive. Some of them were small, and others were endless. Others were like galaxies hanging in the sky. The 48 pictures somehow captured all the different aspects of water powers. Han Sen looked at the 48 paintings, and his knowledge of water powers increased by several levels. It looks like God's power really is quite impressive. It can read my body composition and place a water mind in the paintings for me. When the Extreme King elites came here, they must have each seen a mind that matched their own powers. That is why they became so much stronger. Frowning, Han Sen muttered to himself, "This god is like King Kun. They both have very strong powers, but for some reason, there are restrictions that keep them from utilizing all of their strength. This is the only chance I have against them, as the ordinary creature that I am. Otherwise, this god could surely destroy the universe itself. But fighting a god by God's rules? The chances of winning are still pretty low." Han Sen then suddenly thought of Asura. Asura left behind the Asura Sutra, or the falsified Sky Sutra, which had causal powers. And Asura had actually consumed a god. Was that god the same type as King Kun? But Han Sen had eventually learned that the god Asura consumed was something like a Buddha. Although the Buddha were strong, they didn't reach god status. Maybe that was just a coincidence, Han Sen thought to himself. Han Sen kept looking at the 48 paintings, all the while thinking about what he might wish for. Gaining more water power was great for Han Senator. Ancient water gods' ancient god origin had caused the original Water King body to develop, so the king area's utility had definitely increased. Learning more through these paintings would also be helpful, but because of his black crystal armor, Han Sen's body was locked down. That god could probably only feel the original Water King body, which was why the paintings only held a water mind. If Han Sen had access to all his genoarts, he could have learned a great deal more from the paintings. But the black crystal armor wasn't giving Han Sen the opportunity to do that, and Han Sen couldn't understand why. It was similar to how the black crystal armor had hidden from the Geno Hall. A month was a long time though. Han Sen was able to think about all this slowly, as he had plenty of time to learn the water minds that were available. With his own water mind knowledge deepening, Han Sen's water element shocking sky punch became stronger. As he understood more and more, Han Sen continued to modify the technique. Han Sen hadn't yet made a wish. This was the last day he would be allowed to remain inside the tower, and he was still learning the water minds in the paintings. The painting in front of Han Sen started to talk. "You made a deal with me. You must make a wish. If you don't, you cannot be allowed to leave Destiny's tower. And you know this." Han Sen laughed and said, "I am going to make the wish now." God was threatening Han Senator if Han Sen didn't keep his promise. He wouldn't be allowed out even if the Extreme King opened Destiny's tower. But Han Sen thought this threat was very interesting. It seemed that, for some reason, God didn't want to offend the Extreme King. Otherwise, he would have just let Han Sen reach the time limit without reminding him. That proved that God was planning to let Han Sen go instead of forcing him to stay. "Then come to me and tell me your wish," the man said in a cool voice. His face remained impassive. Han Sen returned to the 7th floor of Destiny's tower and walked in front of the man. "You do not have much time. Tell me your wish," the man said. "Can you fulfill any wish I want?" Han Sen asked, looking at the man. "Yes. Anything you want," the man surely said. "Can I look for someone?" Han Sen asked. "Of course." The man was answering without hesitation. He must have heard many strange wishes in his time. Looking for someone might have been a very common wish. "Good. Then, can you please tell me where my great-granddad is?" Han Sen didn't make a tricky wish or try to trap God. His wish was simple. When the man heard it, he thought the wish was very simple as well. You wouldn't have to bend the rules to fulfill this request. What is your great-grandfather's name? The man asked. Aren't you God? You must know. Han's son said with a chuckle. Fine, the man said casually. He looked at Han's son, but the reflection in his eyes kept changing. Chapter 2405. One punch to blow up a god. Han's son made this wish because he wanted to know which great-granddad Han Jinji actually was. If Han Jinji had been an ordinary man, then he would have already died and left the world. In that case, God wouldn't be able to find out where he was. At most, God would track him back to a gravesite. If Han Sen's great-granddad was actually the legendary figure he'd been told about, then Han Jinji had already escaped the powers of a god once. He must have been really powerful himself. This man who called himself God should have had a hard time finding someone like that. Somewhere in the universe, on a planet, in a certain street, a fortune teller was sitting on the road. He was eating noodles, making loud slurping noises as he sucked them down. Suddenly, the fortune teller's face changed. He accidentally dropped the noodles onto the ground as he shouted, "Who is tricking me?" The fortune teller's fingers twitched for a second. When he spoke again, his voice sounded furious. "That traitorous bastard tricked me." While he was talking, the fortune teller quickly pulled something out of his bag. He bit his middle finger and let a drop of blood fall onto the item. He mumbled, "What a shame. Getting this treasure took so much work. When I go back, I'm going to teach that little bastard a lesson." A fox was walking down the road, and she saw the fortune teller holding an article of underwear decorated with flowers. He looked as if he was in pain. She stared at him, but the fortune teller didn't even seem to notice. His face remained twisted in discomfort. In Destiny's Tower, the man looked at Han Senator. The images reflected in his eyes kept changing, but all of them gleamed brightly. Han's son had made a wish. When the wish was complete, the man could use his power on Han Senator. Tracing Han Sen's bloodline would be very easy, as it was just a basic power. It didn't even require any special tricks. As the spell ran, the man considered different ways he could maximize his earnings from someone making such a wish. While he was in thought, the image in the man's eyes kept changing. The gleam of power in those eyes was constant, but the images within them began to whirl faster and faster. "Arg!" the man suddenly screamed. He covered his godly-looking eyes. Han's son frowned and looked at the man. He didn't know what had happened. While he was wondering, he suddenly heard a pang. That man's eyes exploded, leaving behind 2 black holes. From the empty air of the room around them, a godlike voice laughed darkly. "How dare you spy on me? This time, I'm only taking away your eyes. Next time, I will destroy your body." "No, impossible. How could you be his heir?" "That is impossible," screamed the man whose eyes had been incinerated. "Whose heir?" Hansen asked the man. Now he could see the wounds clearly. The holes in the man's eyes weren't flesh. They were rimmed with a jade-like substance. His eyes were completely destroyed, and there wasn't a single drop of blood. The eyeless man looked creepy. The empty pits stared at Han's son as the man gnashed his teeth. "It doesn't matter if you are his heir or not. You made a wish, and so you must pay the price. Plus, there is no way you are his heir." "You haven't told me where he is," Hansen said. "He is where he should be," the man said sternly. "This is wrong. You have broken the rules." Hansen frowned. "The rules are simple. I have done what you asked, and so, you must pay up." The man looked quite angry. "What if I don't pay up?" Hansen asked, glaring at the man. "That isn't up to you." The man laughed in a grating voice. A light began to shine around his body, like the aura of some ancient sky god. Hansen's face suddenly changed. He noticed his lifespan had been drastically reduced. Normal creatures in the Geno universe couldn't detect their own lifespan, but Han's son had come from the sanctuaries. He could see his own lifespan. Hansen's maximum lifespan was reducing, year by year. It was transforming into a barely visible light and drifting toward the man. "If this place wasn't Destiny's Tower, you would be giving me more than just years from your lifespan for destroying my eyes," the man seethed. "That was unlucky. I made a wish and received nothing. And on top of that, My lifespan is being stolen. These so-called gods are quite fickle. Han Sen was furious and he had to act. He couldn't allow himself to lose any more years. He had already lost a dozen years, and the man was still sapping away even more. Han Sen didn't know how much lifespan the man planned on taking in payment for this wish. But now Han Sen understood why the Extreme King didn't complain about the consequences of their wishes. A part of their lifespan was probably taken away. But unlike Han Sen, they had no way of knowing what was happening. Even if they did notice that something was different, they wouldn't know how much of their lifespan had been stolen. As his lifespan drained away, Han Sen felt something powerful activate inside his Sea of Soul. That black crystal armor, hanging in his Sea of Soul, suddenly moved. Without Han Sen's summoning, the black crystal armor appeared and floated in front of Han Senator. That black set of armor looked as if it could absorb all light. It made those who looked at it feel as if they were in the deepest recesses of hell. Han Sen froze as he looked upon the black crystal armor. The moment the armor floated in front of him, his lifespan had stopped decreasing. His connection with the man had been severed as decisively as if it had been snipped with a pair of scissors. Han Sen stopped losing years. What is going on? I've only taken a dozen years, but it should have been 153 years. Why is this happening? The man didn't seem to notice the presence of the black crystal armor. He looked very confused. He turned his eyeless sockets back to Han Senator. The empty pits that were once eyes stared at Han Senator. He obviously wasn't adjusting well to his new handicap. The black crystal armor, floating in front of Han Sen, lifted its gauntlet arm. In that moment, it looked more like a real person than an empty set of armor. It raised its hand and made a fist. The black crystal armor walked up to the man, but he didn't seem to notice it. When the black crystal armor stepped in front of the man, the clenched fist suddenly launched in a savage punch. Boom! The man's body exploded. He was like a rock being reduced to powder in an instant. Beneath the power of that fist, he was nothing more than dust on the wind. The man who had called himself God was blown up in a single punch. An iridescent power that Han Sen could barely see rose from the exploded body. Then it drifted into Han Sr. Lifespan +1. Lifespan +1. Han Sen's lifespan began to shoot upward. In seconds, he had earned an additional 100 years. He was gaining lifespan much faster than he had lost it, and the process was still accelerating. 200 years, 300 years, 500 years. Han Sen watched his own lifespan increase, and as he did, his heart began to pound. He felt as if it was going to jump out of his chest. Chapter 2406. 9-spin destiny mirror. Once every drop of that strange power had drifted into Han Sen's body. His lifespan reached 1787. In less than a minute, his lifespan had increased by half a millennium. I wonder how many years he has taken from the Extreme King. This cannot be all, surely. Han Sen asked the black crystal armor, directing a greedy stare at where the man's body had been. The black crystal armor ignored him. It turned around and returned to his Sea of Soul. Just like before, it hung in a corner of the Sea of Soul without moving an inch. The moment the guy that called himself God was destroyed, far away, in a mysterious palace, a man frowned and said, "Empty God. Even if my god doll offended you, you could have just taken his eyes. Instead, you actually killed him. Do you think I am afraid of you?" In the streets, the fortune teller looked at the broken article of underwear in his hand, then let it go. It was reduced to dust. He sighed and said, "What a shame. It was hard to get my hands on that item." He picked up his bowl of noodles that had fallen to the ground and wiped the bowl clean with a cloth. Then he put the bowl away. Picking up his sign, which read Destiny, he walked down the street and disappeared amidst the crowds. Han Sen watched the man turn to dust, and as he did, he realized that his time was up. He quickly ran down through the tower. As he ran, he thought to himself, "If the Extreme King finds out the statue is destroyed, they won't come after me, will they? I won't admit I was the one to destroy it. But even if I said I did, they wouldn't believe I was able to, would they?" When Han Sen reached the 6th floor, he saw that the paintings were still hanging on the walls. but the meaning and influence behind them had disappeared. They were just ordinary paintings now. It was like this all the way down. All of the paintings had lost their god minds. They were nothing special anymore. Weird. Fox Queen said the 9-spin destiny mirror was inside this tower. How come I haven't seen it? With that thought, Han Sun checked the time and realized that he still had 1 hour left. So he decided to look around the tower. He had walked up and down the tower many times over the past month. Aside from the paintings, the man had been the only other thing there. There were no mirrors. Was Fox Queen lying to me? That doesn't make any sense. Lying to me about the mirror wouldn't benefit her in any way. Han Sun frowned and thought to himself, did someone manage to trick Fox Queen herself? Maybe give her bogus intel? If that is the case, then that might mean Fox Queen's identity has been exposed. But Fox Queen is smart. Tricking someone like her would be difficult. Han Sun was both intrigued and a little worried. So he looked into every corner of Destiny's tower with complete thoroughness. There was no 9-spin destiny mirror. There was nothing inside the tower at all. Han Sun could see each floor clearly with just a look. If there was a mirror, he would have seen it. Searching should have been unnecessary. There isn't anywhere to hide things in this tower. Aside from the statue man that looked like a human, but wasn't actually a human. That is. Han Sun suddenly thought of the man who had been sitting atop that pedestal. He returned to the 7th floor. If something was hidden anywhere in this tower, it had to be inside that pedestal. Han Sun hadn't returned to the 7th floor in order to help Fox Queen though. If there really was a treasure like the 9-spin destiny mirror, he would take it for himself. After all, the 9-spin destiny mirror would be a powerful item. The foxes thought that regaining the item would let them take back a prominent place in the universe. Back on the 7th floor, Han Sun looked at the platform the man had been sitting upon. It was just an ordinary stone pedestal. There was nothing special about it. It was made of the same stone that composed the rest of Destiny's tower. Han Sun reached out his hands and pressed against the pedestal. The platform had taken no damage at all. It clearly wasn't something that would break easily. It's a shame that I used all my 9-spin fox power. Otherwise, I could try to use that power to summon the mirror. Han Sun went silent for a moment, then extended one of his fingers over the stone. He allowed a droplet of blood to fall down onto the pedestal. That blood was infused with the power of the Blood Pulse Sutra. Han Sun wanted to see if the platform was spiritual in some capacity. When the blood splashed onto the stone, the platform began to shake. The blood then blended into the pedestal, and it shook even harder. Suddenly, the platform floated up into the air. It hovered, its stone enamel cracking and flaking off from the violent tremoring. Soon, the real face of the pedestal began to be revealed. A while later, the stone surface shattered completely, revealing the stone mirror inside. When Han Sun let another droplet of blood bleed onto the stone mirror, silver light glowed from the mirror. Within the reflective surface, Han Sun saw the shadow of a silver 9-tailed fox. Those 9 tails swayed softly, as the small fox eyes regarded Han Sr. Buzz! The stone mirror started to fly. Spinning around Han Senator, the stone mirror was the size of a mortar and pestle, but it shrank until it was around the size of Han Sen's hand. It landed in his palm, and then the light completely disappeared. The shadow of the 9-tailed fox in the mirror was gone. Han Sun lifted the mirror, and he realized that it no longer reflected anything. It was just a piece of grayish-white stone. Even if he tried to polish it with a soft fabric, the mirror refused to show a reflection. But on the back of the stone mirror, Han Sun found an engraving of the 9-tailed fox. It was just like the shadow Han Sun had seen when the mirror was glowing. The droplet of blood had vanished. It seemed to have disappeared when the stone mirror activated. Han Sun played with the stone mirror for a while, but he was unable to find out how to use it. He couldn't activate the stone mirror's power. I can try to use my blood to gain control of it. Maybe it will come to recognize me like the jade drum did. Han Sun put away the stone mirror and waited until the departure time was upon him. When that time rolled around, Destiny's tower opened. Quickly he rushed out of there. The Extreme King didn't seem to know anything about what had transpired inside Destiny's tower, which made him feel very relieved. He said his goodbyes and returned to Planet Water Zone's underwater town. If you were that powerful, you should have just done it sooner. If something like that happens again, you don't need to wait around before cutting the bad guy down. Kill a few more gods, and we'll live a lot longer, Han Sen said to the black crystal armor in his Sea of Soul once he had returned to his room. But the black crystal armor didn't move. It behaved as it always did, like a dead object. When the black crystal armor didn't react, Han Sen left it alone. He rested at home for a few more days, waiting to see if the Extreme King noticed any changes in Destiny's Tower. Luckily, the Extreme King was none the wise. They didn't seem to have a clue that the man statue inside Destiny's Tower had been destroyed. It made Han Sen feel much safer. Han Sen, Super God Spirit Body Geno Battle Body, Mutant Blood Duke, Spell Duke, Dongxian King, Jadeskin Duke Level King Genes, 22 Deified Progress, 12% Lifespan, 1787 He isn't dead? Upon learning that Han Sen was alive, and had visited Destiny's Tower, Fox Queen was amazed. Chapter 2407. Entering the core area again, Fox Queen wanted to go to Planet Water Zone immediately to see if Han Sen had managed to get the 9-spin Destiny Mirror from Destiny's Tower. But Bai Songlong had something he needed her to do, so she didn't have time to go to Planet Water Zone yet. In order to protect her cover identity, she had to suppress her impatience for the time being. But Fox Queen couldn't stop thinking about how Han Sen had activated the Sacred Blood statue, yet somehow managed to survive. She couldn't figure out how he had pulled that off. Long ago, Sacred Leader used the Sacred Blood statue to control subordinates. Even his deified soldiers were subject to it. And the Sacred Blood statue on Han Sen's back had been drawn in ancient blood dragon lady's blood. That sort of Sacred Blood statue was reserved for use against deifieds. Han Sen was just a duke. He wasn't even a king yet, so how could he survive? Fox Queen was very confused, but it would be a while before she could travel to Planet Water Zone and find answers to her questions. After Han Sen returned to Underwater Town, he began researching the 9-spin Destiny Mirror. He couldn't discover anything unique about it. He put power into it, but he couldn't seem to activate the item. His only option was to drip his blood onto the stone mirror in the hope that it would come to acknowledge him as its master further down the line. Every time Han Sen placed his blood upon the stone mirror, it would light up with the shadow of the 9-tailed fox. When the shadow disappeared, the blood would go with it. Han Sen was trying to use the same method he had with the jade drum, but it didn't seem to be working. Did King Bao put the fox's 9-spin Destiny Mirror in Destiny's Tower and place it beneath that statue? If so, why would he do that? Han Sen couldn't come up with any answers to that question. The stone mirror wasn't making any progress, and for the moment, there didn't seem to be anything Han Sen could do about that. The water fairy in the jade gourd was helping Han Sen grow stronger, though. She embodied the feelings of the proud bone sword mind for him. And as a result, Han Sen felt as if his own sword mind was about to have a breakthrough. Han Sen didn't copy Mad Sword mind, though. He used his own sword mind to fight with Mad Swords. At first the fights were entirely one-sided, but after a while, Han Sen started to develop some resistance. Mad sword mind wasn't suitable for Han Sen, so he didn't plan on using it directly. Instead, he used it as a grinding stone, sharpening his own sword mind against it. It doesn't matter how strong Mad sword mind is, it isn't my own. It would only belong to me if I could fully understand it. Although improvements like this were much slower than if he were to simply copy Mad sword mind, Han Sen wasn't in any particular rush. He focused on each aspect of his sword mind, improving it a piece at a time. Although Han Sen had many King-class core genes, and he had 100 King-class Xenogeneic genes, he would need many more in the coming days. So, Han Sen still planned on going back to the core area to hunt for more core genes. It was always good to have more in the shed after all. If Han Sen's guess was correct, 100 King-class Xenogeneic genes might raise his king area by 1 tier. Han Sen pushed his self-cogwheel to enter the core area again. He returned to the location where he had left, which wasn't too far from Planet Dark Zone. Han Sen wouldn't dare visit Planet Dark Zone again until he had enough strength. Provoking that weird insect would basically mean committing suicide. His super god body didn't make him invincible, and the time limit was always a headache. Once I become deified, will I be able to use an infinite amount of super god spirit body? Han Sen wondered as he flew. What a coincidence. Are you interested in cooperating again? Han Sen hadn't been flying for long when a group of people approached him. It was Dragon 1, Dragon 8, and some other dragons. But Dragon 1 and Dragon 8 were the only dragons who had survived their last venture. The dragons accompanying them now were new. Han Sen didn't answer. From another direction, a second group of people was swiftly approaching. The leader of that bunch was Robber. As he flew closer, he said, "If you guys are cooperating, might it be okay if we join?" Han Sen was shocked. He had only just entered the core area, and these two had already found him. This couldn't be a coincidence. People, I am flattered. But I was hoping to venture out alone this time. Maybe another time? Han Sen said, rejecting their offers politely. He didn't know what they were after, and he didn't want to fight with them. Han Sen turned to leave, but Robber immediately said, "If you don't wish to work with us, that's fine. But I have a few Mutant King-class Xenogeneics to go after. Are you interested in taking a look?" Han Sen stopped. It took time to find mutant Xenogeneics, so being able to travel straight to them would be a great help for Han Sen's leveling. If they were killing mutants, Han Sen could gain the Xenogeneics' talents without needing to practice them. Not bad, not bad. I have a lead on a few mutant Xenogeneics as well. If you are interested, you know the rules and shares, Dragon 1 then said. Han Sen was very tempted by both offers. If things really were as they said, killing a few mutant Xenogeneics would be very beneficial for Han Senator Plus. He would be getting 50% of the spoils from the entire fight, not just what he personally killed. And there would be no need to spend time seeking the Xenogeneics out. Opportunities like this were hard to come by. After a brief period of silent thought, Han Sen still turned down both offers. If he chose a side now, he would only end up offending the other. Han Sen wasn't worried about offending others, but in this case, it was unnecessary. Since Han Sen hadn't agreed, they still wouldn't be able to kill those mutant Xenogeneics by themselves. They would need Han Sen's help in the future anyway. Perhaps he could receive more benefits like this later on. Dragon 1 and Robber seemed to expect Han Sen to turn them down, so they didn't appear to be disappointed. They still spoke to Han Sen with glee and respect, hoping they could cooperate again in the near future. Why are you so nice to him? Do you think the destroyed need a king like him? Bar asked once Han Sen had left. Robber was one of the few people that could make Bar listen. If Robber wasn't there, he would have fought Han Senator. It wasn't that Bar didn't like Han Sen. He just enjoyed fighting powerful people. Robber nodded with sincerity, and he said, "Yes, we really need someone like him." Seeing Bar fall silent, Robber sighed and said, "We need him because he is stronger than us. Sure, the deified members of our race are stronger than he is, but that matters little because they can't enter the core area. If they cannot come, then they cannot come. What's the big deal?" Bar grunted in annoyance. Robber smiled and said, "There is no big deal. But if we want to kill deified core Xenogeneics in the core area, then we need him. Do you think our destroyed kings could escape a deified Xenogeneic the way did? If they didn't have an area power to restrict strength, an ordinary deified Xenogeneic couldn't kill me," Bar said. "You are the best king we have, but hunting deified Xenogeneics with just you and I would be an impossible task. We might succeed, but we would sacrifice a lot. With Dollar's help, that can change. The success rate would be higher, and we wouldn't sacrifice as much. What is the harm in that?" Robber asked, shaking his head. "You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."